In the grim darkness of the far future, where heroes are measured by their capacity for violence and redemption comes only through blood, there exists a chapter of Space Marines so savage that even their own allies fear to stand beside them. They are the Flesh Tearers, and their very name sends shivers through the spines of Imperial commanders who have witnessed their work. These are not mere warriors. These are barely contained monsters wearing the Emperor's colors, sons of the angelic Primarch Sanguinius, who have inherited not his nobility, but his darkest, most terrible curse. Picture the aftermath of a Flesh Tearer's victory. The battlefield stretches before you, painted crimson with the blood of enemies and allies alike. Imperial guardsmen huddle in their trenches, not in fear of the enemy, but in terror of their supposed saviors. The Space Marines of the Flesh Tearers move through the carnage like predators, their crimson and bone-white armor splattered with gore, their eyes burning with an inhuman hunger that no amount of killing can satisfy. They have won the battle, yes, but at what cost to their very souls? For 10,000 years, this chapter has walked the razor's edge between heroism and damnation, serving the Emperor while fighting a war against their own nature. They are the product of a failed experiment, the inheritors of a genetic curse so terrible that it drives them to acts of cannibalism and mindless rage. Yet they endure, they fight, they die for the Imperium that barely tolerates their existence. They are living proof that sometimes the line between monster and hero is drawn not in what you are but in what you choose to fight against. Tonight, you will discover the complete and terrible truth behind the Flesh Tearers. You will learn of their founding by a man so violent that even his fellow blood angels called him monster. You will witness their golden age, when their savagery was celebrated as necessary brutality. You will see them fall into corruption so complete that their own fortress monastery became a battlefield between the loyal and the damned. You will experience their near destruction, when fewer than 200 warriors remained of a once mighty chapter. But this is not merely a tale of fall and redemption. This is the story of what happens when the Imperium creates weapons so terrible that they threaten to destroy not just the enemy but everything they were meant to protect. For in the depths of their fortress on the death world of Cretacia, something went terribly wrong. Something that would force battle brothers to turn their weapons against each other. Something that would see their own chapter master make a choice that would echo through 10 millennia. The blood runs deeper than you know. And the truth behind the Flesh Tearers is more horrifying than any Xenos threat they have ever faced. To understand the darkness that would consume the Flesh Tearers, we must first journey back to the Great Crusade, to an age when the galaxy burned with the fires of imperial expansion, and the Emperor's dream of human dominion seemed within reach. It was a time of heroes and legends, yet even then, beneath the glory and the triumph, seeds of future horror were already taking root in the genetic code of the Space Marines. The Blood Angels Legion had always been different from their brothers. Where other legions prided themselves on tactical precision or technological mastery, the Sons of Sanguinius were known for something far more primal. A barely contained ferocity that could transform them from noble warriors into savage berserkers in the space of a heartbeat. This was not mere battle fury. This was something deeper, something that whispered in their genes and called to them from the depths of their enhanced biology. Captain Nassir Amit of the Blood Angels' 5th Company was the embodiment of everything his legion tried to hide from the rest of the Imperium. Standing over 8 feet tall even without his power armor, Amit was a giant among giants. His scarred features twisted into a permanent scowl that spoke of countless battles and endless violence. His eyes held a predatory gleam that made even his fellow Astartes uncomfortable. And when he smiled, which was rarely, it revealed teeth that had been filed to points in the tradition of his homeworld's ancient warrior cults. The other captains whispered about Amit behind closed doors, speaking in hushed tones about his methods and his results. Where other companies took prisoners for interrogation, Amit's warriors left only corpses. Where others showed mercy to surrendering enemies, the 5th Company showed only the swift brutality of the chainblade and bolt round. They called him the Flesh Tearer, and the name was not given in jest or admiration, but in a mixture of fear and disgust at what he had become. During the compliance of Melchior, Amit's company had been tasked with taking a fortified position held by human rebels who had rejected the Emperor's truth. The battle should have been straightforward, a textbook assault that would demonstrate the superiority of Astartes tactics over primitive resistance. Instead, it became a massacre that would haunt the Legion's records for decades to come. Amit's warriors had breached the walls within hours, but instead of accepting the defenders' surrender, they had continued killing until no living soul remained within the fortress. The aftermath had been horrific beyond description. Imperial army regulars who entered the fortress after the battle found evidence of cannibalism, of ritual mutilation, of acts so savage that even hardened veterans had vomited at the sight. The rebels had not merely been killed, they had been devoured, their flesh consumed in a feeding frenzy that spoke of madness rather than military necessity. When questioned about the incident, Amit had simply shrugged and remarked that his warriors had worked up an appetite during the fighting. Primarch Sanguinius himself had arrived to investigate the matter, his perfect features marred by an expression of deep concern and growing horror. The great angel walked through the blood-stained halls of the fortress, his enhanced senses detecting the lingering psychic echoes of what had transpired within those walls. What he found there would trouble him for the remainder of his days, for he recognized in the savage acts of his sons the same darkness that sometimes stirred within his own perfect heart. The genetic curse of the Blood Angels was not merely a tendency toward violence, though the Legion's commanders had convinced themselves that this was all it was. In truth, it was something far more sinister, a flaw in their very creation that would only grow stronger with each passing generation. The Red Thirst, as the Legion's apothecaries had begun to call it in their classified reports, was not a bug in their genetic programming. It was a feature, something deliberately written into their DNA by forces that neither they nor their creators fully understood. As the Great Crusade continued, reports began to filter back to Terra about similar incidents involving Blood Angels forces. A company would take a fortified position and be found days later still feeding on the corpses of their enemies. Battle Brothers would disappear from their squads during combat, only to be discovered later in a catatonic state, their armor drenched in blood and their memories completely blank. The Legion's chaplains spoke of spiritual weakness and insufficient faith, but the apothecaries knew better. This was not a failure of the spirit. This was a corruption of the flesh itself. The Horus heresy would prove to be the catalyst that transformed this genetic predisposition into something far worse. As the galaxy burned and brother fought against brother, the psychic trauma of the Civil War began to manifest in ways that no one had anticipated. The warp itself seemed to feed on the violence and betrayal, growing stronger with each act of treachery and each drop of spilled blood. For the Blood Angels, already teetering on the edge of genetic instability, the heresy would prove to be the push that sent them tumbling into the abyss. Captain Amit's 5th Company found themselves at the forefront of some of the bloodiest battles of the age, fighting alongside the Imperial fists to defend the walls of the Imperial Palace itself. Night after night they repelled the attacks of traitor forces, their weapons growing hot from constant use, and their armor becoming so stained with blood that its original colors were no longer visible. It was during these desperate battles that the true extent of their curse began to manifest. Battle Brothers, who had served faithfully for decades, began to succumb to episodes of uncontrollable rage, attacking friend and foe alike with equal savagery. Others fell into catatonic trances, their minds apparently lost to visions of blood and death that played out behind their eyes like twisted recordings. The company's chaplains worked desperately to maintain discipline and morale, but they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that came from within their own genetic code. The Siege of Terra reached its climax with the Emperor's confrontation with Horus aboard the War Master's battle barge, a psychic duel that sent shockwaves through the warp itself. When Sanguinius fell defending his father, every Blood Angel in the galaxy felt his death like a physical blow, a psychic scream that echoed through their enhanced nervous systems and burned itself into their genetic memory. For Amit and his warriors, already pushed to the breaking point by months of constant warfare, this final trauma would prove to be the tipping point that sent them spiraling into madness. In the immediate aftermath of the heresy, as the Imperium struggled to rebuild itself from the ashes of civil war, the surviving Blood Angels found themselves forever changed by what they had endured. The curse that had once been controllable, manageable, had now become something far more sinister. It was no longer enough to speak of spiritual weakness or insufficient faith. This was a corruption that went to the very core of what they were, a flaw that would be passed down through their gene seed to every future generation of their sons. The stage was now set for the creation of the Flesh Tears chapter, though none who witnessed those dark days could have predicted the horrors that would follow. The end of the Horus heresy brought with it a reckoning that would reshape the very foundations of the Imperium. Robout Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, stood among the ruins of a galaxy torn apart by civil war and made a decision that would echo through the millennia. The Space Marine legions, those vast armies of transhuman warriors that had conquered the stars in the name of the Emperor, were simply too powerful to be trusted as unified forces. The betrayal of half the legions during the heresy had proven that such concentrations of military might were inherently dangerous to the stability of the Imperium itself. The Codex Astartes, Guilliman's masterwork of military doctrine and organization, mandated that each legion be broken apart into smaller chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors each. This division was not merely about reducing the size of individual forces, it was about creating a system of checks and balances that would make another heresy far more difficult to orchestrate. Yet for all its strategic wisdom, the second founding would also create opportunities for problems to fester and grow in isolation, away from the moderating influence of larger command structures. Captain Nassir Amit received the news of his promotion to chapter master with characteristic stoicism. The Flesh Tears, as his new chapter would be known, would inherit his reputation along with his gene seed. There was a certain brutal honesty to the decision, an acknowledgement by the Blood Angel's command that Amit and his most violent warriors were perhaps better suited to operating independently than remaining within the parent legion's increasingly refined and noble ranks. The selection process for the new chapter was conducted with clinical efficiency by the Blood Angel's apothecaries and chaplains. They identified those battle brothers whose records showed the highest incidence of uncontrolled rage, the greatest tendency toward excessive violence, and the strongest manifestations of what was euphemistically called combat enthusiasm. These warriors, nearly 400 in total, would form the core of the Flesh Tearers chapter. It was, in many ways, both an honor and an exile, a recognition of their martial prowess, coupled with an admission that they were too dangerous to remain among their more stable brothers. The newly formed chapter required a homeworld, and the selection of Cretacia was made with careful consideration of both practical and symbolic factors. This death world in the Segmentum Solar was a place where survival depended entirely on one's capacity for violence and adaptation to extreme conditions. The native human population had evolved a culture that revered strength above all else, where ritualistic combat and ceremonial scarification were considered sacred rites of passage. For warriors already struggling with their own violent impulses, it seemed the perfect match. Cretacia itself was a harsh mistress, a world where massive predatory creatures hunted through jungles so dense that daylight rarely reached the forest floor. The human tribes that had managed to survive in this environment had done so by becoming predators themselves, developing hunting techniques and warrior traditions that bordered on the savage. They practiced ritual cannibalism as a means of honoring fallen enemies, believing that consuming the flesh of the brave would transfer their courage and skill to the victor. For the Flesh Tears, these practices would not seem alien or disturbing. They would feel like coming home. The construction of the chapter's fortress monastery began almost immediately upon their arrival on Cretacia. Unlike the soaring spires and magnificent architecture favored by other chapters, the Flesh Tears stronghold was built with practicality and containment in mind. The massive structure was carved directly into the living rock of a mountain plateau, its corridors and chambers designed more like a prison than a palace. Multiple levels of reinforced barriers separated different sections of the complex, and every room could be sealed independently in case of emergency. The chapter's organizational structure followed the general guidelines of the Codex Astartes, but with significant modifications necessitated by their unique circumstances. The chaplaincy was expanded far beyond normal proportions, with nearly twice the usual number of spiritual counselors assigned to monitor the mental and spiritual health of the battle brothers. These chaplains were not merely concerned with matters of faith and doctrine. They were the chapter's first line of defense against the genetic curse that threatened to consume them all. The Apothecarium, too, received special attention and resources. The chapter's medical facilities were among the most advanced in the Imperium, equipped with experimental gene therapy equipment and specialized containment units designed to house battle brothers who had succumbed to uncontrollable rage episodes. The Flesh Tears chief apothecary was granted unprecedented authority to conduct research into the nature of their genetic curse, with access to archives and specimens that would have been denied to most other chapters. Recruitment protocols were established that took into account both the harsh realities of Cretacia and the specific needs of the chapter. Potential aspirants were selected not just for their physical prowess and genetic compatibility, but for their psychological stability and capacity to channel violent impulses in productive directions. The trials they faced were deliberately designed to test not only strength and courage, but also self-control and the ability to function as part of a disciplined military unit even under extreme stress. The first generation of Cretacean recruits proved to be remarkably well suited to the chapter's needs. These young warriors had grown up in an environment where controlled violence was not only accepted but celebrated, where the line between civilization and savagery was much thinner than on most Imperial worlds. They adapted to the flesh-tearers' methods with an ease that might have been disturbing to outside observers, but which provided exactly the kind of stable foundation that Amit needed to build his chapter upon. The chapter cult that developed during these early years was a fascinating blend of Imperial doctrine, Blood Angels traditions, and native Cretacean beliefs. The Emperor was revered as the ultimate warrior, the perfect predator whose strength had allowed him to conquer the galaxy and establish humanity's dominance over the stars. Sanguinius was honored not merely as a primarch, but as the great hunter whose death had consecrated all his sons as eternal warriors in an endless war against the enemies of mankind. The fortress monastery itself became a living symbol of the chapter's dual nature. Its upper levels housed magnificent shrines and chapels where the Battle Brothers could contemplate the nobler aspects of their calling, while its deeper chambers contained the harsh realities of their existence. Training areas designed for combat practice that often resulted in serious injuries, medical bays equipped to treat wounds that would have killed ordinary humans, and, most ominously, specially reinforced cells designed to contain those who had lost control of themselves entirely. Chapter Master Amit established a command structure that reflected both his personal leadership style and the practical necessities of managing warriors prone to extreme violence. Company captains were selected not just for their tactical acumen, but for their ability to maintain discipline among troops who might at any moment succumb to homicidal rage. Sergeants were trained in techniques for recognizing the early signs of curse manifestation, and were given both the authority and the means to deal with affected battle brothers before they could endanger their squadmates. The chapter's early years were marked by a series of successful campaigns that established their reputation throughout the Segmentum Solar. Their methods were unquestionably effective, if brutal. Orc infestations that had resisted Imperial forces for decades were eliminated within weeks of the Flesh-Tearers' arrival. Chaos cultist uprisings were crushed with such thoroughness that entire worlds forgot they had ever harbored heretical thoughts. The chapter's kill ratios were among the highest in the Imperium, a testament to both their martial prowess and their complete lack of mercy toward the enemies of mankind. Yet even in these early victories, careful observers might have noticed troubling signs. The Flesh-Tearers' casualty rates, while low in absolute terms, showed an unusual pattern. A disproportionate number of their losses came not from enemy action, but from what the official reports euphemistically termed training accidents and equipment malfunctions. Battle Brothers died during practice duels that escalated beyond their intended limits. Others suffered fatal injuries from weapons that somehow discharged during routine maintenance. These incidents were individually explainable, but collectively they painted a picture of a chapter where violence was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. The transformation was subtle but inexorable. With each passing year, each new generation of recruits, the Flesh-Tearers found themselves drifting further from the ideals they had inherited from their parent legion. The noble restraint that had once characterized the Blood Angels was replaced by a philosophy that celebrated strength and dominance above all other virtues. The chapter's chaplains began to preach that mercy was weakness, that hesitation in battle was tantamount to heresy, and that the Emperor's will could only be served through the complete annihilation of his enemies. This ideological shift did not happen overnight, nor was it the result of any single decision or event. Rather, it was the natural consequence of placing warriors with violent tendencies in an environment that not only tolerated but actively encouraged those tendencies. Each small transgression made the next one easier to justify. Each act of excessive brutality became precedent for even greater extremes. The chapter was walking down a path that would lead them far from the light of the Emperor, though none of them realized it at the time. By the end of their first century, as an independent chapter, the Flesh-Tearers had established themselves as one of the most feared fighting forces in the Imperium. Their reputation preceded them wherever they went, causing both enemies and allies to approach them with a mixture of respect and apprehension. They had successfully carved out their own identity, distinct from their Blood Angels' heritage, yet still recognizably loyal to the Emperor's cause. But beneath the surface of their success, deeper currents were beginning to stir. The genetic curse that had always been present in their bloodline was beginning to manifest in new and more dangerous ways. The controlled violence that had once been their strength was threatening to become an uncontrollable weakness. And in the depths of their fortress monastery on Cretaceous, forces were gathering that would eventually threaten not just the chapter, but potentially the entire sector around them. The first true test of the Flesh Tears as an independent chapter came barely 3 decades after their founding, when reports reached Terra of a massive orc incursion threatening the industrial worlds of the Lathe system. The Greenskin Horde, estimated at over 2 million strong, had already overrun the outer planets and was making steady progress toward the vital forge worlds that supplied weapons and equipment to dozens of nearby sectors. Imperial Guard regiments had been deployed to contain the threat, but their efforts had proven woefully inadequate against the sheer scale and ferocity of the alien invasion. Chapter Master Amit received the deployment orders with what could only be described as anticipation. This would be the Flesh Tears' opportunity to prove themselves on a scale that had not been possible during their smaller engagements against pirates and cultists. More importantly for Amit, it would give his warriors the chance to unleash their full potential against an enemy that deserved no mercy and would show none in return. The orcs were the perfect opponents for the Flesh Tears, creatures whose own savage nature meant that any brutality visited upon them could be justified as both necessary and appropriate. The chapter fleet arrived in the Lathe system to find the situation even worse than the initial reports had suggested. 3 of the 5 inhabited worlds had already fallen to the Greenskin Tide, their populations either dead or enslaved by the Xenos invaders. The remaining Imperial forces had consolidated around the 2 Forge worlds, but their defensive perimeters were shrinking daily as the Orc assault intensified. The local Imperial Guard commander, General Vespasian Kurtz, was a veteran of dozens of campaigns, but even his experience had not prepared him for the reality of fighting an Orc Wav of this magnitude. When the Flesh Tears made planetfall on Lathe Prime, the industrial heart of the system, their arrival was marked by a display of martial prowess that would be remembered by witnesses for the rest of their lives. The chapter's drop pods came down directly in the midst of the largest Orc concentration, a move that conventional military wisdom would have deemed suicidal. For the Flesh Tears, however, it was simply the most efficient way to begin the slaughter they had come to deliver. The battle that followed defied every tactical manual ever written by Imperial strategists. Instead of establishing secure landing zones and coordinating with existing defensive positions, the Flesh Tears simply began killing. They moved through the Orc formations like a plague of death, their chain blades and bolt rounds cutting down dozens of enemies every minute. What was most remarkable was not just their effectiveness but the manner in which they fought. These were not the disciplined volleys and coordinated assaults favored by most Space Marine chapters. This was something far more primal, a form of warfare that seemed to channel pure aggression into lethal effectiveness. Brother Captain Krendel of the 3rd Company later described the sensation of fighting alongside his new chapter brothers as both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. The Flesh Tears, he observed, did not simply kill their enemies. They destroyed them so completely that identification of the remains was often impossible. Orc corpses were found torn apart by bare hands, their weapons broken and their war machines reduced to scrap metal by warriors who seemed to possess inhuman strength when the battle fury took hold of them. General Kurtz, watching the battle unfold from his command bunker, found himself experiencing emotions he had never felt in 3 decades of military service. Relief that such powerful allies had arrived was mixed with a growing unease at the methods they employed. The Flesh Tears fought with a savagery that exceeded even that of their Orc opponents, turning what should have been a methodical clearing operation into something that resembled a feeding frenzy more than a military engagement. The effectiveness of the chapter's assault could not be disputed. Within 6 hours of their arrival, the Orc forces that had been threatening the primary manufactorum complex were completely annihilated. Not routed, not defeated, but literally wiped from existence with such thoroughness that even the carrion birds that normally followed Orc armies had nothing left to feast upon. The Greenskins' crude fortifications had not merely been overrun, they had been obliterated with such violence that the rubble was mixed with organic matter that was no longer recognizably Xenos in origin. Word of the Flesh Tears' victory spread quickly through the Imperial forces defending the other threatened positions. Morale soared as soldiers who had been preparing for a last stand, suddenly found themselves believing that the tide of battle could be turned. Requests for flesh tears support began flooding in from every sector of the front, with commanders competing to have the Space Marines assigned to their particular crisis points. Yet as the campaign progressed, disturbing reports began to reach General Kurtz and his staff. Imperial Guard units operating in areas recently cleared by the flesh tears reported finding evidence of activities that went far beyond normal post-battle procedures. Orc corpses had been mutilated in ways that served no tactical purpose, their flesh stripped away and consumed in what appeared to be ritual feeding. Guard medics treating wounded flesh tears reported that several of the Space Marines had arrived at field hospitals with fresh blood around their mouths and under their fingernails, blood that genetic analysis confirmed was Xenos in origin. The most troubling incident occurred during the liberation of Hive Secundus, a massive population center that the Orcs had been using as a slave labor camp. The flesh tears assault on the facility was characteristically brutal and effective, with the Xenos garrison eliminated within hours of the attack beginning. However, when Imperial Guard units arrived to process the liberated prisoners, they found evidence that not all the killing had been done by Orc weapons. Dozens of human civilians bore wounds that could only have been inflicted by chain blades and bolt rounds, their bodies showing signs of the same ritualistic mutilation that had been observed among the Xenos corpses. When questioned about these casualties, Captain Gorvek of the Flesh Tears 5th Company claimed that the humans had been so corrupted by their contact with the Xenos that they could no longer be considered loyal Imperial citizens. Their deaths, he insisted, had been a mercy that prevented them from spreading that corruption to others. General Kurtz found himself in an increasingly difficult position. The Flesh Tears were undeniably effective, perhaps the most effective fighting force he had ever witnessed. Their presence on the battlefield guaranteed victory, and their reputation was beginning to precede them to such a degree that some Orc formations were actually retreating before the Space Marines had even engaged them. Yet the reports of excessive brutality and what could only be described as cannibalistic behavior were becoming too frequent and too detailed to ignore. The situation came to a head during the final assault on the Orc warlord's fortress, a massive structure built from salvaged Imperial technology and Xenos ingenuity that had resisted all previous attempts to breach its defenses. The Flesh Tears volunteered to lead the assault, and Kurtz, despite his growing misgivings, approved their request. The alternative would have been a prolonged siege that could have lasted months and cost thousands of Imperial lives. The fortress fell in less than 4 hours, a military achievement that should have been celebrated throughout the sector. The Orc warlord, a creature the size of a small building whose personal tally of Imperial kills numbered in the thousands, was found dead in his throne room, his massive corpse torn apart with such violence that it took forensic specialists several days to determine what had killed him. The other Orc nobles and their retinues had suffered similar fates, their remains scattered throughout the complex in ways that suggested they had been hunted down and killed individually rather than falling in organized combat. When General Kurtz and his staff entered the conquered fortress to survey their victory, they found the Flesh Tears engaged in what could only be described as a feast. The Space Marines had gathered in the Warlord's Great Hall, where they were consuming portions of Xenos flesh in what appeared to be a ritualistic celebration of their victory. Brother Captain Krendel, his usually composed demeanor replaced by something wild and predatory, explained that they were honoring their fallen enemies by consuming their essence, a practice that he claimed dated back to the earliest days of their chapter. The sight of transhuman warriors, the Emperor's chosen defenders of mankind, engaged in acts that most civilized humans would consider abhorrent, left a lasting impression on every Imperial officer who witnessed it. Some would later describe feeling physically sick at the sight, while others reported experiencing an almost hypnotic fascination with the ritual consumption taking place before them. All agreed that what they saw that day changed their understanding of what the Space Marines truly were beneath their noble rhetoric and sacred oaths. The campaign's end came swiftly after the warlord's death, as the remaining Orc forces, deprived of leadership and terrified by the fate of their commanders, began to turn on each other or flee the system entirely. The Latho worlds were saved, their vital industrial capacity preserved for the Imperium, and the threat of the Xenos invasion was eliminated completely. By any objective measure, the Flesh Tears had achieved a stunning victory that would be remembered for generations. Yet the manner of their victory raised questions that would follow the chapter for decades to come. Imperial commanders throughout the sector found themselves requesting Flesh Tears assistance while simultaneously hoping that such assistance would not be necessary. The chapter's reputation for effectiveness was matched only by their reputation for brutality, creating a complex relationship between the Space Marines and the forces they were sworn to protect. Chapter Master Amit, reviewing the campaign reports from his fortress monastery on Cretaceous, expressed satisfaction with his warriors' performance while dismissing concerns about their methods as the squeamishness of lesser beings who did not understand the true nature of warfare. The Emperor, he reasoned, had created the Space Marines to be weapons against humanity's enemies, and weapons were most effective when they were used without hesitation or restraint. The fact that some found their methods disturbing was simply proof that they were fulfilling their intended function. This philosophy would guide the chapter through the centuries that followed, as they built their reputation on a foundation of uncompromising violence and absolute dedication to the destruction of the Emperor's enemies. Each victory reinforced their belief that their methods were not only justified but necessary, while the growing unease of their allies was dismissed as weakness and lack of understanding. The Flesh-Tearers had announced themselves to the galaxy as a force of unprecedented savagery, and that announcement would echo through the void for millennia to come, drawing both admiration and horror from those who heard it. In the centuries following their victory at Leith, the Flesh-Tearers experienced what historians would later recognize as their Golden Age, a period spanning from M32 to M35 when the chapter operated at peak efficiency and enjoyed something approaching respectability within the broader Imperial military hierarchy. During these years, the chapter's numbers swelled to their maximum sustainable level, with over 1,000 battle brothers serving across 10 full companies plus additional specialized units. Their fortress monastery on Cretaceous underwent massive expansion, growing from a functional military installation into a sprawling complex that rivaled the great strongholds of the first founding chapters. The key to understanding this period of prosperity lies in recognizing how the Flesh-Tearers had successfully learned to channel their violent impulses into forms that the Imperium not only tolerated, but actively celebrated. Chapter Master Amit, now centuries old, and bearing the accumulated wisdom of countless campaigns, had developed what he called the doctrine of controlled savagery, a philosophical framework that justified extreme violence as a necessary tool for achieving imperial objectives, while maintaining enough discipline to avoid becoming a threat to friendly forces. This doctrine was codified in a series of texts known as the Crimson Codex, written by the chapter's chaplains and approved by Amit himself. These writings represented the first systematic attempt to reconcile the Flesh-Tearers' nature with their duties as servants of the Emperor. The central premise was that human nature contained both noble and savage elements, and that the Emperor had deliberately enhanced the savage aspects in his Space Marines to create weapons capable of facing the horrors that threatened mankind. To deny or suppress this savagery was therefore not only futile but actually contrary to the Emperor's design. The practical implementation of this doctrine involved a complex system of rituals, training exercises, and combat protocols designed to allow the chapter's warriors to express their violent impulses in constructive ways while maintaining the discipline necessary for effective military operations. Battle brothers participated in daily sparring matches that often resulted in serious injuries, the theory being that warriors who had already satisfied their need for violence through ritual combat would be more capable of restraint when fighting alongside Imperial allies. The chapter's recruitment program during this period was remarkably sophisticated, drawing not only on Cretaceous' native population, but also identifying suitable candidates from across the Segmentum Solar. Flesh-Tearers recruitment teams would arrive at worlds that had recently experienced major conflicts, seeking out young survivors who had demonstrated both the physical resilience and psychological flexibility necessary to adapt to the chapter's unique culture. These recruits underwent a selection process that was as much psychological evaluation as physical testing, with chapter chaplains carefully assessing each candidate's capacity to channel violent impulses in productive directions. The training regimen developed for new initiates was unlike anything employed by other Space Marine chapters. Recruits spent years learning not just the mechanics of warfare, but the philosophy behind controlled violence. They studied the writings of ancient warriors from Terra's history, learning how legendary figures like the Hun warlords and Viking berserkers had harnessed savagery for strategic purposes. They practiced meditation techniques designed to help them recognize the onset of rage episodes and channel that energy into focused aggression rather than mindless violence. The chapter's relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus during this period was particularly productive. resulting in the development of several technological innovations that would become hallmarks of flesh-tearers warfare. The Tech Marines assigned to the chapter worked closely with Forge Masters from several nearby Forge worlds to create specialized variants of standard Space Marine equipment designed to enhance the effectiveness of close combat operations while providing additional safeguards against friendly fire incidents. One of the most significant innovations was the development of specialized power armor variants that incorporated enhanced audio dampening systems and reinforced restraint mechanisms. These modifications served a dual purpose, both improving the armor's performance in close-quarters combat and providing a means of containing battle brothers who had succumbed to uncontrollable rage episodes. The armor's machine spirits were programmed with behavioral recognition protocols that could detect when a warrior was losing control and automatically engage safety systems to prevent him from harming allies. The chapter's weaponry also received considerable attention during this period. Flesh-tearers artificers developed improved variants of chain weapons that incorporated specialized teeth designed for maximum tissue damage while reducing the risk of weapon jams during extended combat. Their bolt weapons were modified to fire specialized ammunition that expanded upon impact, creating wounds that would incapacitate enemies more quickly and reduce the likelihood that desperate foes would continue fighting after being hit. Perhaps most importantly, the chapter invested heavily in medical technology designed to understand and potentially control their genetic curse. The Fortress Monastery's apothecarium was expanded into a research facility that rivaled those found on major Forge worlds, equipped with gene sequencing equipment, biological analysis laboratories, and specialized containment units for studying the physiological effects of the Red Thirst and Black Rage. Chief Apothecary Galen Voss, a warrior who had served with distinction since the chapter's founding, led a team of specialists in a comprehensive study of the flesh-tearers' genetic heritage. The research conducted during these centuries produced several significant breakthroughs in understanding the nature of the chapter's curse. Voss and his team identified specific genetic markers associated with susceptibility to rage episodes and developed screening techniques that allowed them to predict which battle brothers were most at risk of losing control during combat operations. They also made progress in understanding the neurochemical processes underlying the Red Thirst, discovering that the compulsion to consume blood was linked to specific deficiencies in the Space Marine enhancement process. More practically, the research led to the development of pharmaceutical interventions that could delay or reduce the severity of curse manifestations. Battle brothers identified as high risk could be treated with specialized drug cocktails that helped stabilize their neurochemistry and reduce the likelihood of violent episodes. These treatments were not cures, and they came with their own side effects, but they represented the first real progress the chapter had made in controlling their genetic heritage rather than simply accepting it. The cultural development of the chapter during this period was equally impressive. The Flesh-Tearers evolved from a collection of violent warriors held together by shared genetics and common enemies into a true brotherhood with its own unique identity and traditions. The influence of Cretacean culture became more pronounced as more natives of the Death World rose through the chapter's ranks, bringing with them traditions and perspectives that complemented the chapter's martial nature. The Fortress Monastery itself became a work of art as much as a military installation. The upper levels, accessible to visitors and dignitaries, showcased magnificent galleries filled with trophies from the chapter's greatest victories. These displays served both ceremonial and practical purposes, reminding both the chapter's members and their guests of the Flesh-Tearers' martial achievements while subtly reinforcing the message that violence, when properly directed, could be both beautiful and beneficial. The lower levels of the complex told a different story, one that few outsiders were ever permitted to see. Here, the reality of the chapter's curse was acknowledged and accommodated through a series of specialized facilities designed to manage the darker aspects of their nature. Training chambers where battle brothers could engage in ritualized combat without risk of permanent injury. Medical bays equipped to treat wounds that would have been fatal to ordinary humans. And most soberly, containment cells designed to house warriors who had completely lost control of themselves. The chapter's relationship with Imperial authorities during this period was complex but generally positive. The Flesh-Tearers' effectiveness in combat was undeniable, and their willingness to accept the most dangerous and thankless assignments made them valuable assets to sector commanders who needed results more than they needed comfort. Their reputation for brutality was balanced by their demonstrated loyalty to the Emperor and their consistent success in achieving assigned objectives. Several notable campaigns during this period established the Flesh-Tearers as one of the most effective fighting forces in the Imperium. The Ghoul Stars expedition of M33 saw the chapter working alongside elements of 3 other Space Marine chapters to investigate mysterious disappearances in a remote sector. While the other chapters focused on reconnaissance and information gathering, the Flesh-Tearers took responsibility for direct combat operations against whatever was causing the disappearances. Their methods were characteristically brutal, but they succeeded in eliminating a previously unknown xenospecies that had been preying on human settlements for decades. The Bodab sector compliance of M34 demonstrated the chapter's ability to operate effectively in complex political situations. When several worlds in the sector declared independence from Imperial rule, the Flesh-Tearers were deployed as part of a multi-chapter task force to restore order. While other Space Marines attempted to negotiate with the rebel leadership, the Flesh-Tearers systematically eliminated the military forces supporting the rebellion, leaving the political leaders with no choice but to surrender unconditionally. Throughout all these successes, however, careful observers might have noticed subtle signs that not everything was as stable as it appeared. The chapter's casualty rates, while not excessive by Space Marine standards, showed unusual patterns that suggested internal conflicts were becoming more frequent. Training accidents occurred more often than statistical models would predict, and the chapter's medical facilities were consistently operating at higher capacity than would be expected for a force that rarely suffered significant losses in actual combat. The chaplaincy, despite its expanded size and enhanced training, was struggling to maintain spiritual discipline among warriors whose nature drove them toward increasingly extreme forms of violence. Reports from this period described chaplains spending more and more time counseling battle brothers who were experiencing doubts about their ability to control their impulses, and the chapter's confession records show a marked increase in admissions of unauthorized violence against Imperial citizens and even fellow Space Marines. Most ominously, the Death Company, that grim institution inherited from the Blood Angels, and designed to channel the Black Rage into useful military action, was growing larger with each passing decade. What had begun as a small unit of perhaps a dozen warriors had expanded to include nearly 50 battle brothers at any given time, with the number continuing to increase despite the chapter's best efforts to understand and control the underlying condition. As the Golden Age drew toward its close, the Flesh-Tearers stood at the pinnacle of their power and influence. They commanded respect throughout the Segmentum Solar, maintained one of the most advanced military installations in the Imperium, and possessed knowledge and capabilities that many other chapters envied. Yet beneath this impressive exterior, forces were gathering that would eventually challenge everything they had built and threaten not only their continued existence, but their very identity as loyal servants of the Emperor. The stage was set for the events that would transform the Flesh-Tearers from celebrated heroes into something far more ambiguous, as the contradictions inherent in their nature began to manifest in ways that no amount of doctrine or discipline could contain. By the beginning of M35, the Flesh-Tearers had transcended their origins, as a problematic offshoot of the Blood Angels Legion, to become something entirely new within the Imperial military hierarchy. Their reputation for brutal effectiveness had spread far beyond the Segmentum Solar, reaching the ears of sector commanders and planetary governors, who faced threats that conventional Imperial forces seemed incapable of handling. What made the chapter truly dangerous, however, was not merely their willingness to employ extreme violence, but their growing conviction that such violence was not only necessary but morally superior to the restraint practiced by other Imperial forces. The philosophical framework that would come to define this period began with a series of treatises written by Chief Librarian Malachar the Sanguine, a warrior whose psychic gifts had been enhanced rather than diminished by his chapter's genetic curse. Malachar argued that the Emperor's creation of the Space Marines represented a deliberate evolution beyond baseline humanity, and that attempts to constrain transhuman warriors with merely human moral frameworks were both illogical and counterproductive. The Flesh-Tearers, he contended, were simply more honest about their nature than their more hypocritical brothers who practiced the same violence while cloaking it in noble rhetoric. This doctrine of honest brutality began to attract followers far beyond the chapter itself. Imperial Guard officers who had served alongside the Flesh-Tearers found themselves questioning the tactical restraints they had been taught, wondering whether their own reluctance to employ extreme measures was actually cowardice disguised as nobility. Planetary Defense Force commanders began requesting training exchanges with the chapter, seeking to learn methods that could make their own forces more effective against increasingly desperate threats. The first formal implementation of Flesh-Tearer's doctrine outside their own ranks occurred on the hive world of Mordian 7, where Governor Palatine Vex Korath faced a worker uprising that threatened to paralyze the planet's vital manufacturing output. Traditional crowd control methods had proven ineffective against protesters who seemed willing to die rather than return to their factories, and Korath found himself considering increasingly extreme options to restore order. When a Flesh-Tearer's strike cruiser arrived in system to resupply during a longer campaign, Korath requested a meeting with Captain Gorvek to discuss alternative approaches to civil unrest. The conversation that took place in the governor's palace would later be cited by Imperial historians as a turning point in the relationship between the Imperium's civilian and military authorities. Gorvik listened to Korath's description of the situation with the patience of a predator evaluating prey, then offered a solution that was as simple as it was shocking. Rather than attempting to suppress the uprising through negotiation or minimal force, he suggested that Korath select a representative sample of the protesters and execute them publicly in the most brutal manner possible, ensuring that the survivors would understand the consequences of continued defiance. The implementation of this strategy exceeded even Gorvek's expectations, in terms of both effectiveness and psychological impact. The selected protesters were subjected to execution methods that had been deliberately chosen for their capacity to instill terror in witnesses. The remaining population, confronted with the reality of what resistance would bring upon them, returned to their duties with an enthusiasm that surprised even the planet's overseers. More importantly for the long-term development of Imperial policy, Governor Korath found himself convinced that the Flesh-Tearer's approach represented a more honest and effective form of governance than the elaborate bureaucratic structures he had previously employed. Word of the Mordian 7 solution spread rapidly through the network of planetary governors and sector administrators who faced similar challenges in maintaining order among increasingly restive populations. The galaxy of the 35th millennium was becoming a more dangerous place, with Xenos incursions, chaos cults, and simple human desperation creating conditions that traditional Imperial responses seemed inadequate to address. The Flesh-Tearers offered an alternative that promised results, even if those results came at a moral cost that many officials preferred not to examine too closely. The chapter's influence began to manifest in military doctrine as well as civilian policy. Imperial Guard regiments that had operated alongside the Flesh-Tearers returned to their home units with new ideas about the proper application of force in combat situations. These veterans spoke of the effectiveness of terror tactics, the value of eliminating enemy leadership through targeted brutality, and the psychological advantages that came from demonstrating absolute ruthlessness to both enemies and allies. Their accounts were initially dismissed by more conservative commanders as the exaggerations of soldiers traumatized by excessive exposure to Space Marine methods. But the undeniable success of units that adopted these techniques began to change minds throughout the Imperial military establishment. The Schola Progenium, that venerable institution responsible for training the Imperium's future leaders, found itself hosting an increasing number of guest lectures by Flesh-Tearers veterans who had been invited to share their expertise in handling extreme situations. These presentations, initially intended as specialized instruction for students destined for particularly challenging assignments, became so popular that attendance was eventually opened to the general student body. Young commissars and future planetary governors sat in rapt attention as battle-scarred Space Marines described the practical applications of controlled savagery in maintaining Imperial order. Perhaps most significantly, the Flesh-Tearers doctrine began to influence the development of new Imperial Guard regiments recruited from worlds that had experienced their methods firsthand. The Cretacean shock troops, drawn from the chapter's own homeworld, were the first formal implementation of this approach. These regiments combined traditional Guard training with tactical philosophies derived directly from Space Marine practice, creating forces that were markedly more aggressive and brutal than conventional Imperial infantry while remaining disciplined enough to operate effectively alongside other Imperial units. The success of the Cretacean regiments led to requests from other worlds to develop similar forces using their own populations. The Mordian Iron Guard incorporated elements of flesh-tearers doctrine into their already rigid discipline, creating soldiers who were capable of extreme violence while maintaining their characteristic precision and order. The Tallarn Desert Raiders adopted terror tactics that proved devastatingly effective against enemies who relied on mobility and stealth, using controlled brutality to force opponents into pitched battles where conventional Imperial advantages could be brought to bear. This expansion of influence was not without its critics within the Imperial hierarchy. The ecclesiarchy, already suspicious of any doctrine that seemed to celebrate violence for its own sake, began to express concerns about the spiritual implications of adopting methods that appeared to contradict the emperor's teachings about the value of human life and the importance of mercy. Cardinal Hieronymus Vex of the Segmentum Solar issued a formal statement questioning whether the flesh-tearers approach was compatible with true imperial faith, arguing that the emperor's sacrifice had been motivated by love for humanity rather than contempt for human weakness. The Adeptus Arbites, responsible for maintaining law and order throughout the Imperium, found themselves in an increasingly difficult position as local authorities began implementing flesh-tearers-inspired policies for dealing with civil unrest and criminal activity. Arbites commanders reported that while these methods were undeniably effective in the short term, they seemed to be creating long-term problems by fostering resentment and desperation among civilian populations. More troubling were reports that some Arbites units were beginning to adopt similar approaches without proper authorization, leading to incidents that required significant resources to contain and cover up. Within the Space Marine community itself, the reaction to the flesh-tearers' growing influence was decidedly mixed. The Imperial Fists, with their emphasis on duty and defensive warfare, expressed private concerns that the chapter's methods were undermining the reputation of all Space Marines as protectors of humanity rather than mere weapons of destruction. The Ultramarines, ever concerned with proper adherence to established doctrine, questioned whether the flesh-tearers' interpretation of their role was consistent with the intentions of the Emperor and the teachings of the Codex Astartes. More surprisingly, some chapters that might have been expected to support the flesh-tearers' approach instead expressed reservations about the implications of their philosophy. The World Eater's successor chapters, many of which struggled with their own violent impulses, worried that openly celebrating brutality would make their own efforts at maintaining discipline more difficult. The Space Wolves, despite their own reputation for ferocity, distinguished between the honest fury of warriors in battle and the calculated cruelty that the flesh-tearers seemed to advocate as policy. The Blood Angels themselves found the situation particularly troubling, as their successor chapters' actions reflected directly on their own reputation and heritage. Chapter Master Dante made several private attempts to counsel the flesh-tearers' leadership about the long-term consequences of their chosen path, warning that the Imperium's tolerance for extreme methods had limits that even Space Marines could not safely exceed. These conversations were received politely but had little apparent effect on the flesh-tearers' continued expansion of their influence throughout the sector. As the doctrine of controlled savagery continued to spread, its effects began to manifest in ways that even its advocates had not anticipated. Worlds that had adopted flesh-tearers' methods for dealing with internal threats found themselves becoming more militaristic and authoritarian in all aspects of governance. Civilian populations that had been subjected to these techniques showed signs of psychological trauma that persisted for generations, creating cultures of fear and compliance that some observers worried were making these worlds more vulnerable to chaos infiltration rather than less. The economic implications were equally complex. Worlds that had implemented extreme disciplinary measures often experienced short-term increases in productivity as their populations worked harder to avoid attracting official attention. However, these gains frequently came at the cost of innovation and initiative, as citizens became increasingly reluctant to take risks or propose changes that might be interpreted as criticism of existing arrangements. The result was a form of stagnation that some Imperial economists argued was ultimately more dangerous to long-term Imperial interests than the original problems the harsh measures had been intended to address. Perhaps most ominously, the success of the flesh-tearers' doctrine was beginning to attract attention from forces that did not have the Imperium's best interests at heart. Chaos cults found that worlds governed through fear and brutality were often easier to infiltrate than those ruled through more traditional means, as populations that had been systematically terrorized by their own government were more susceptible to promises of liberation through any means necessary. The very methods that were intended to strengthen Imperial control were in some cases creating the conditions that would make rebellion more likely rather than less. By the end of Met 35, the Flesh Tears had achieved something that few Space Marine chapters could claim. They had fundamentally altered the way that significant portions of the Imperial military and civilian hierarchy thought about the application of force and the maintenance of order. Their influence extended far beyond their own relatively small numbers, reaching into the training halls of the Schola Progenium, the strategy chambers of planetary governors, and the tactical doctrines of entire Imperial Guard regiments. Yet this success came with a price that was not immediately apparent to those who celebrated the effectiveness of the new approaches. The Imperium was changing, becoming harder and more brutal in ways that would have profound implications for its future development. The question that remained unanswered was whether this transformation represented a necessary adaptation to increasingly dangerous times, or the first steps down a path that would ultimately lead the Imperium away from the ideals for which the Emperor had originally fought. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong within the Flesh Tears came not from their enemies or their critics, but from their own records. Chief Apothecary Galen Voss, now in his 4th century of service to the chapter, noticed subtle patterns in the medical data that troubled his scientifically trained mind. Battle Brothers were taking longer to recover from what the chapter euphemistically called enthusiasm episodes, those periods of uncontrolled violence that had once been brief aberrations, but were becoming extended periods of barely contained madness. What particularly concerned Voss was the neurochemical analysis of warriors who had recently experienced these episodes. The brain scans showed patterns of activity that resembled those found in subjects exposed to psychoactive compounds, as if the Battle Brothers' own bodies were producing substances that altered their consciousness in ways that medical science could not fully explain. More troubling still, these changes appeared to be permanent rather than temporary, with each episode leaving the affected warrior slightly but measurably different from his previous baseline. The chapter's chaplains initially dismissed these findings as the overcautious concerns of a medical specialist who failed to understand the spiritual dimensions of their condition. Brother Chaplain Asmodai the Penitent argued that what Voss was interpreting as pathological changes were actually signs of spiritual evolution, evidence that the chapter's warriors were transcending the limitations of baseline human psychology to become something more suited to their role as the Emperor's instruments of righteous wrath. This interpretation was comforting to many within the chapter, as it suggested that their increasing struggles with self-control were actually progress rather than deterioration. However, other evidence began to emerge that was more difficult to rationalize away. Training accidents, which had always been somewhat common in a chapter that prided itself on realistic combat preparation, began to display patterns that suggested they were not entirely accidental. Battle Brothers would arrive at medical facilities with injuries that indicated their training partners had continued attacking them well after any reasonable sparring match should have ended. More disturbing were the injuries themselves, which often showed signs of ritualistic mutilation that served no practical training purpose. Brother Captain Krendel of the 3rd Company found himself dealing with an increasing number of disciplinary issues that defied easy categorization. Warriors under his command would disappear from their assigned duties for hours or even days, only to return with no memory of where they had been or what they had done during their absence. When questioned, these Battle Brothers would describe experiencing vivid dreams or visions that felt more real than their waking experiences. Dreams that invariably involved scenes of violence and consumption that left them both disturbed and strangely exhilarated. The chapter's serfs, those mortal humans who maintained the fortress monastery and assisted the Space Marines in their daily operations, began to exhibit signs of psychological distress that their supervisors initially attributed to the normal stresses of serving such demanding masters. However, the patterns of their distress were unlike anything documented in other Space Marine chapters. The serfs complained of persistent nightmares involving blood and violence, dreams so vivid and disturbing that many began to avoid sleep altogether rather than experience them repeatedly. More concretely troubling were the physical symptoms that began to manifest among the serf population. Previously healthy individuals developed unexplained anemia that did not respond to conventional treatment. Others exhibited signs of nutritional deficiency despite having access to adequate food supplies, as if their bodies were failing to properly process the nutrients they consumed. The chapter's medical staff, already overwhelmed by the increasing demands of treating Space Marine enthusiasm episodes, found themselves struggling to understand and treat conditions that seemed to have no clear biological cause. The fortress monastery itself began to show signs of change that were subtle but unmistakable to those who had served within its walls for decades. Corridors that had once been efficiently lit began to develop areas of shadow that seemed to persist regardless of maintenance efforts to improve the lighting. Temperature variations appeared in sections of the complex that had previously maintained stable environmental conditions, with some areas becoming uncomfortably cold while others grew oppressively warm without any apparent mechanical cause. Most unsettling were the sounds that began to echo through the monastery's halls during the quiet hours of the night cycle. Veterans who had lived in the complex for centuries reported hearing voices speaking in languages they did not recognize, or the sound of movement in areas that security sensors indicated were empty. These phenomena were initially dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations, or the normal settling sounds of an ancient structure, but their persistence and consistency across multiple witnesses made such explanations increasingly inadequate. The chapter's librarians, those psychically gifted warriors responsible for monitoring spiritual threats, began to detect disturbances in the warp that seemed to center on the fortress monastery itself. Brother Librarian Malachar the Sanguine, despite his philosophical support for the chapter's doctrine, expressed private concerns about psychic emanations that reminded him uncomfortably of the signatures associated with chaos corruption. These emanations were subtle and diffuse, making them difficult to trace to any specific source, but their presence was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. Chapter Master Amit, now ancient by Space Marine standards but still possessed of the terrible vitality that had made him legendary, found himself struggling with decisions that would once have seemed straightforward. The clarity of purpose that had guided him through centuries of warfare was becoming clouded by impulses and desires that seemed to come from outside his own consciousness. He began to experience moments when he could not clearly remember issuing orders that his subordinates claimed to have received from him, or when he would find himself in sections of the monastery with no clear recollection of how he had arrived there. The chapter's recruitment procedures, once a source of pride for their scientific rigor and psychological screening, began to produce results that defied explanation. Aspirants who passed all physical and mental evaluations would sometimes undergo catastrophic psychological breakdown during the implantation process, experiencing seizures and violent episodes that required them to be permanently restrained or eliminated for the safety of the medical staff. More disturbing were the aspirants who completed the process successfully but emerged with personality changes that went far beyond the normal psychological adaptation expected from Space Marine transformation. These new battle brothers exhibited an enthusiasm for violence that exceeded even the chapter's deliberately cultivated standards. They seemed to derive genuine pleasure from inflicting pain and suffering, not merely as a necessary tool for achieving military objectives, but as an end in itself. Their integration into existing squads proved problematic, as veteran warriors found their new brothers' attitudes disturbing even by the chapter's relaxed standards regarding acceptable behavior in combat. The chapter's relationship with their allies began to deteriorate in ways that were initially subtle but gradually became impossible to ignore. Imperial Guard units that had previously requested Flesh Tear's support began to find excuses to operate independently, even when facing threats that clearly exceeded their capabilities. Naval commanders who had once competed for the honor of transporting the chapter to new battlefields began to submit reports citing technical difficulties or scheduling conflicts that prevented them from providing such services. More seriously, other Space Marine chapters began to express concerns about the Flesh Tear's methods and reliability. The Blood Angels, already troubled by their successor chapter's reputation, sent a formal inquiry regarding reports of excessive casualties among Imperial forces operating alongside the Flesh Tears. The Imperial Fist requested clarification about incidents involving the destruction of civilian infrastructure that appeared to serve no military purpose. Even chapters with their own reputations for brutality, such as the Iron Hands, began to question whether the Flesh Tears were crossing lines that should not be crossed. The Inquisition, that shadowy organization responsible for detecting and eliminating threats to Imperial security, began to take a more active interest in the chapter's activities. Inquisitor Vex Korath of the Ordo Hereticus initiated a discreet investigation into reports of unusual behavior among worlds that had implemented Flesh Tears-inspired policies for maintaining order. His preliminary findings suggested correlations between exposure to the chapter's methods and increased incidence of heretical activity, though the mechanisms underlying these correlations remained unclear. Perhaps most ominously, the chapter's own records began to show inconsistencies that suggested either systematic falsification or widespread memory problems among the warriors responsible for maintaining them. Battle reports contained gaps and contradictions that made it difficult to determine what had actually occurred during specific engagements. Casualty figures varied between different versions of the same documents, with some reports indicating losses that other records suggested had never happened. The normally meticulous record-keeping that was a hallmark of Space Marine organization was breaking down in ways that made it increasingly difficult to maintain oversight of the chapter's activities. Chief Apothecary Voss, reviewing the accumulated evidence of his decades of service, found himself confronting a possibility that challenged everything he thought he knew about his chapter and his calling. The changes he had been documenting were not random variations or the products of environmental stress. They formed a pattern that suggested systematic deterioration, as if some external force was gradually corrupting everything the chapter touched. The medical evidence, the psychological profiles, the incident reports, and the environmental changes all pointed toward a conclusion that he was reluctant to accept, but could no longer deny. The flesh tears were changing into something that was no longer entirely loyal to the Emperor, or bound by the oaths they had sworn to protect humanity. The transformation was subtle and gradual, which made it all the more dangerous because it allowed those affected to rationalize each small step as acceptable while losing sight of how far they had already traveled down a path that led away from everything they had once stood for. As M36 dawned, the chapter stood at a crossroads that its members did not yet fully recognize. The signs of corruption were becoming too numerous and too obvious to ignore, but the institutional inertia and psychological investment in their current path made meaningful change seem impossible. The forces that had been subtly influencing their development for decades were growing stronger and more confident, preparing to reveal themselves when the time was right for a final confrontation that would determine whether the flesh-tearers would remain servants of the Emperor or become something altogether more sinister. The corruption had taken root so gradually, and so completely, that most of the chapter's warriors believed they were still the same loyal Space Marines they had always been, even as they performed acts that would have horrified their earlier selves. The true test of their character was approaching, and nothing in their long history of violence and brutality had prepared them for the enemy they would soon face within their own ranks. The true nature of the threat facing the flesh-tearers became apparent during what should have been a routine cleansing operation on the agri-world of Thessian Prime. The planet had been experiencing crop failures and livestock mutations that Imperial authorities attributed to Xenos contamination, requiring the services of a Space Marine force to investigate and eliminate whatever alien presence was responsible for the agricultural problems. Captain Gorvek led 2 full companies to the world, expecting to spend perhaps a few weeks hunting down and destroying whatever minor Xenos threat had established itself among the farming communities. What they found instead defied every tactical manual and threat assessment protocol that the chapter developed over its centuries of existence. The mutations affecting Thessian Prime's agricultural products were not the result of Xenos interference, but rather manifestations of warp contamination that seemed to originate from the flesh-tearers themselves. Everywhere the Space Marines established temporary bases or conducted extended operations, the local environment began to change in ways that suggested the presence of forces that existed beyond the material universe. Brother Librarian Malachar, accompanying the expedition to provide psychic reconnaissance support, detected warp signatures that were both familiar and deeply disturbing. The emanations reminded him of the patterns he had been sensing within the fortress monastery, but here they were magnified and focused in ways that made their malevolent nature unmistakable. More troubling still, the signatures seemed to be coming not from external sources, but from within the chapter's own forces, as if the Battle Brothers themselves had become conduits for influences that should not exist in real space. The first direct manifestation occurred during what should have been a simple search and destroy mission against a suspected Janestealer infestation in the planet's primary agricultural processing facility. Squad Korath of the 4th Company had been tasked with clearing the complex room by room, a straightforward operation that any veteran Space Marine unit could accomplish with minimal risk. Instead, the squad became trapped in a cycle of violence that continued long after all enemy resistance had been eliminated, with the Battle Brothers turning their weapons against the facility's civilian workers and each other in a frenzy of destruction that defied all military logic. When reinforcements arrived to investigate the squad's failure to report in, they found a scene that would haunt the memories of everyone who witnessed it. The processing facility had been transformed into something resembling a ritual site, with the bodies of workers and genstealers alike arranged in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy. Squad Korath was discovered in the center of this arrangement, their armor splattered with blood and their eyes reflecting an intelligence that was no longer entirely human. Captain Gorvik's attempts to restore discipline and order his warriors to withdraw from the facility were met with responses that chilled him to his enhanced bone structure. The affected battle brothers spoke in voices that contained harmonics and inflections that should not have been possible for Space Marine vocal cords to produce. They described visions of a galaxy purged of weakness through endless conflict, where the strong would feast upon the flesh of the defeated, until only the most perfect predators remained to serve powers that existed beyond the comprehension of baseline humanity. The contamination, for lack of a better term, began to spread through the expedition with a speed that suggested it was not merely psychological, but had some deeper biological or spiritual component. Battle brothers who had shown no previous signs of instability began to exhibit the same symptoms that had affected Squad Korath. They became increasingly aggressive toward both enemies and allies, showing a preference for close combat that went beyond tactical necessity to become an obvious desire to inflict maximum suffering upon their victims. More disturbing were the physical changes that began to manifest among the affected warriors. Their enhanced physiology, normally capable of adapting to almost any environmental stress, began to show signs of mutation that served no evolutionary purpose. Teeth elongated and sharpened without any corresponding improvement in combat effectiveness. Fingernails grew into claw-like appendages that interfered with weapon handling. Most grotesquely, some battle brothers developed additional sensory organs that seemed designed to detect and process the fear and pain of nearby living creatures. Chief Apothecary Voss, monitoring the situation from the chapter's fortress monastery through encrypted communications, recognized patterns in the expedition's reports that matched data he had been collecting for decades. The changes occurring on Thession Prime were not isolated incidents, but rather acute manifestations of the same underlying condition that had been gradually affecting the entire chapter. The expedition was serving as an unwitting laboratory where the forces that had been subtly influencing the flesh-tearers for generations were finally revealing themselves openly. The response from Imperial authorities was swift and uncompromising. Inquisitor Korath, already investigating the chapter's activities, declared a quarantine around Thession Prime and demanded immediate withdrawal of all flesh-tearers' forces from the planet. His orders were supported by a battle group from the Imperial Navy that took position around the world with instructions to prevent any ship from leaving the system without proper clearance and extensive contamination screening. Captain Gorvik found himself facing an impossible situation. His warriors were clearly compromised by some form of corruption that he did not understand and could not control. But withdrawing from the planet would mean abandoning battle brothers who might still be saved if the proper treatment could be developed. More fundamentally, he was beginning to question whether the corruption was truly external or whether it represented the natural evolution of tendencies that had always been present within the chapter's genetic heritage. The battle brothers, still capable of rational thought, reported experiencing what they described as revelations about the true nature of their purpose and calling. They spoke of understanding for the first time that their genetic curse was not a flaw to be overcome but a gift to be embraced, a means of transcending the limitations of ordinary humanity to become something more suited to the harsh realities of a galaxy where only the strong deserve to survive. These insights came accompanied by an euphoric sense of liberation from constraints that they had never recognized as artificial until they were removed. The affected warriors began to demonstrate capabilities that exceeded even the enhanced norms of Space Marine performance. Their strength increased to levels that allowed them to tear apart power armor with their bare hands. Their speed and reflexes became so acute that they could dodge point-blank weapons fire and respond to threats faster than the human eye could follow. Most unnaturally, they seemed to develop an ability to sense the emotions and intentions of other living beings, using this information to inflict maximum psychological trauma upon their victims. Brother Chaplain Asmodai the Penitent, sent to Thession Prime to provide spiritual support for the expedition, found his usual tools for maintaining discipline and faith completely inadequate to address the situation. The affected battle brothers showed no interest in confession or absolution, claiming that they had progressed beyond the need for such concepts. They spoke of serving higher powers that made the Emperor seem limited and parochial by comparison, entities that appreciated strength and hunger rather than demanding self-sacrifice and restraint. The theological implications of these claims were staggering for a chapter that had built its entire identity around service to the Emperor and loyalty to the Imperium. If the affected warriors were correct in their assertions, then everything the flesh-tearers had believed about their purpose and calling was fundamentally mistaken. Worse, it suggested that their genetic curse was not a random flaw but a deliberate design feature, intended to make them more suitable servants for powers that were decidedly not aligned with Imperial interests. As the situation on Theshan Prime continued to deteriorate, reports began reaching the chapter's leadership of similar incidents occurring elsewhere throughout their operational area. Worlds that had implemented flesh-tearers-inspired policies were experiencing unexplained outbreaks of violence and civil unrest. Imperial Guard regiments trained using the chapter's methods were showing signs of the same psychological instability that was affecting the Space Marines themselves. The corruption was not confined to the chapter's own ranks but was spreading through every institution and individual that had been touched by their influence. The realization that they might be the source of contamination rather than its victims forced the chapter's leadership to confront possibilities that challenged their fundamental understanding of their own nature and purpose. Chapter Master Amit, reviewing reports from across the sector, began to see patterns that suggested the corruption had been present from the very beginning of the chapter's existence, growing stronger and more obvious with each passing generation but never quite revealing itself until now. The forces that had been manipulating the flesh-tearers were apparently confident enough in their control to begin making demands rather than simply providing subtle guidance. Affected Battle Brothers reported receiving direct communications from entities that identified themselves as the true architects of the chapter's destiny, beings who claimed to have been nurturing and directing their development since the earliest days of their founding. These entities expressed satisfaction with the progress that had been made, and indicated that the time had come for the chapter to openly acknowledge their allegiance and begin serving their actual masters rather than the false idol they had been worshipping. The choice facing the flesh-tearers was becoming clear. Though the chapter's leadership was not yet ready to acknowledge it openly, they could attempt to fight against the corruption that had taken root within their ranks, a battle that would require them to reject not only their recent developments, but potentially their entire identity as shaped by centuries of gradual influence. Alternatively, they could embrace the changes that were occurring and accept the power that was being offered to them, even if that meant abandoning their oaths to the Emperor and the Imperium they had sworn to protect. As the crisis deepened, it became apparent that the corruption was not merely affecting individual battle brothers, but was beginning to manifest in the physical environment around them. The fortress monastery on Cretacia began to show signs of structural change that could not be explained by normal geological or architectural processes. Corridors elongated beyond their original dimensions. Rooms developed additional entrances that led to spaces that had not existed in the original construction plans. Most ominously, areas of the complex began to exhibit environmental conditions that should not have been possible within a sealed structure, including variations in gravity and atmospheric composition that suggested the intrusion of forces from beyond normal space-time. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of the flesh-tearers, but potentially the security of the entire sector. The corruption had revealed itself openly, and its agents were no longer content to work through subtle influence and gradual manipulation. The time for half measures and rationalization had passed, and the chapter would soon be forced to choose between the loyalty they had always professed and the power that was being offered to them by forces that promised to make them the ultimate predators in a galaxy that respected only strength and hunger. The quarantine of Theshan Prime and the increasing scrutiny from Imperial authorities forced Chapter Master Amit to confront a reality that challenged everything he believed about command and leadership. For centuries he had prided himself on his ability to make difficult decisions without hesitation, to cut through complexity and doubt with the same brutal efficiency he brought to combat. Now faced with evidence that his entire chapter might be compromised by forces beyond his understanding, he found himself paralyzed by choices that seemed to offer only different varieties of damnation. The first principle that Amit abandoned was the Codex Astartes requirement for transparency and cooperation with other Imperial institutions. The chapter's communications with outside authorities became increasingly selective, with reports carefully edited to omit references to the more disturbing incidents occurring within their ranks. When Inquisitor Korath requested detailed medical records for all chapter personnel, Amit ordered the creation of falsified documents that portrayed the flesh-tearers as suffering from nothing more serious than minor genetic drift that could be corrected through appropriate medical intervention. This deception required the cooperation of Chief Apothecary Voss, who found himself in the unprecedented position of being ordered to lie to Imperial authorities about matters that directly concerned the safety of the Imperium itself. Voss initially resisted, arguing that concealing the extent of the chapter's problems would only make their ultimate resolution more difficult. When Amit pointed out that revealing the truth would likely result in the chapter being declared excommunicate traitorous and hunted down by their former allies, Voss reluctantly agreed to participate in what he privately considered an act of treason against everything they had sworn to uphold. The falsification of medical records was only the beginning of a systematic campaign to conceal the chapter's true condition from outside observation. Training schedules were restructured to minimize the likelihood that visitors would witness incidents involving uncontrolled violence. Battle brothers showing obvious signs of corruption were reassigned to duties that kept them away from areas where they might encounter outsiders. Most drastically, the chapter began to refuse joint operations with other Imperial forces, claiming that their unique methods were more effective when employed independently. These defensive measures bought the chapter time to pursue more aggressive solutions to their underlying problems. Brother Librarian Malachar, despite his philosophical support for embracing the changes occurring within the chapter, recognized that their current trajectory would inevitably lead to conflict with the broader Imperium. He proposed a radical experiment that would use his psychic abilities to trace the source of the corruption back to its origin, potentially allowing the chapter to understand and control the forces that were affecting them. The psychic investigation that Malachar conducted in the deepest levels of the fortress monastery revealed truths that shattered his understanding of the chapter's history and purpose. The corruption affecting the flesh tears was not a recent development or an external intrusion, but rather the culmination of influences that had been present from the moment of their founding. The entities responsible had been guiding the chapter's development for centuries, gradually shaping their culture and genetics to make them more suitable servants for powers that existed beyond the material universe. More horrifying still was Malachar's discovery that the corruption was not limited to the current generation of flesh tearers. Analysis of gene seed samples dating back to the chapter's earliest years showed traces of the same taint that was now manifesting so obviously in their current warriors. Every battle brother who had ever served the chapter had been carrying this corruption within his enhanced biology, passing it on to the next generation through the gene seed implantation process that was fundamental to space marine reproduction. This revelation forced Amit to confront the possibility that everything the chapter had accomplished, every victory they had won, and every service they had rendered to the Imperium had been part of a larger plan orchestrated by their true masters. Their reputation for brutality, their effectiveness in combat, even their loyalty to the Emperor might all have been tools used to position them for whatever purpose they were ultimately intended to serve. The thought that his life's work might have been nothing more than an elaborate deception filled the ancient warrior with a rage that threatened to consume what remained of his sanity. The psychological impact of these discoveries on the chapter's leadership was devastating. Captain Gorvake, recalled from Theshan Prime under cover of routine rotation, found himself unable to sleep or meditate as he had for centuries. Brother Chaplain Asmodee's attempts to provide spiritual counsel were undermined by his own growing doubts about the nature of the powers they served. Even the normally unflappable Chief Apothecary Voss began to show signs of stress that affected his ability to perform his duties effectively. In this atmosphere of desperation and despair, the chapter began to consider solutions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The first of these was an attempt to purify their gene seed through exposure to Xenos biological material, a technique that violated every protocol governing the handling of space marine genetic material. Voss obtained samples of Eldar genetic material from battlefield casualties, theorizing that the alien psychic resistance might provide immunity against whatever forces were corrupting the chapter's bloodline. The results of these experiments exceeded the worst fears of everyone involved. Battle brothers who received the modified gene seed did indeed show resistance to the corruption affecting their brothers, but they also began to develop characteristics that were recognizably Xenos in nature. Their enhanced senses became so acute that they could no longer tolerate normal lighting or sound levels. Their reaction times increased to such a degree that they had difficulty coordinating with unmodified battle brothers during training exercises. Most disturbing of all, they began to display emotional responses that seemed more suited to alien psychology than human thinking. Despite these obviously negative outcomes, desperation drove the chapter to continue the experiments with increasingly exotic biological samples. Genetic material from captured Tau yielded battle brothers who were capable of remarkable tactical innovations, but who seemed incapable of the passionate commitment to battle that had always characterized the flesh-tearers. Necron tissue samples, obtained at terrible cost during a raid on an awakening tomb world, produced warriors who were immune to both corruption and conventional weapons, but who showed no signs of maintaining their humanity in any recognizable form. Parallel to these biological experiments, the chapter's tech marines began developing mechanical solutions that were equally radical in their departure from established doctrine. Power armor was modified to include neural interface systems that could override a warrior's conscious control when he showed signs of losing control to corruption. These systems worked by detecting the brain wave patterns associated with the onset of uncontrolled violence and automatically engaging restraint protocols that would immobilize the affected battle brother until he could be properly contained. The psychological effects of wearing armor that could paralyze its wearer at any moment proved to be almost as problematic as the corruption the system was designed to prevent. Battle brothers equipped with the modified armor reported feeling like prisoners within their own equipment, never knowing when their next action might trigger the restraint systems. This constant uncertainty made them hesitant and indecisive in combat, exactly the opposite of the aggressive confidence that had always been the chapter's greatest strength. More ambitious still were attempts to develop weapons that could be used against enemies who might be resistant to conventional forms of damage. The chapter's artificers created bolt rounds loaded with sanctified materials that were intended to be effective against demonic entities, should such beings manifest during the ongoing crisis. These experimental munitions incorporated fragments of Imperial saints' relics, blessed oils from the most sacred shrines in the sector, and psychically charged crystals that were supposed to disrupt warp-based manifestations. Testing these weapons against corrupted battle brothers yielded results that were both encouraging and deeply disturbing. The sanctified ammunition was indeed effective against targets showing signs of demonic influence, but it was also lethal to normal space marines who had been exposed to even minimal amounts of corruption. This discovery forced the chapter to confront the reality that there might be no meaningful distinction between their corrupted and uncorrupted members, and that any weapon effective against their enemies might also be effective against themselves. The most desperate innovation of all was an attempt to use the chapter's chaplains as conduits for direct communication with the Emperor himself. Brother Chaplain Asmodai volunteered to undergo a ritual that would temporarily sever his connection to his physical body, allowing his consciousness to travel through the warp to seek guidance from the Master of Mankind. The theoretical foundation for this procedure was sound, based on established techniques for psychic projection that had been used by Imperial mystics for millennia. The ritual itself was conducted in the chapter's most sacred shrine, surrounded by every protective ward and sanctification that the chaplaincy could devise. Asmodai's consciousness successfully separated from his body, and began the perilous journey through the Imperium toward the psychic beacon of the Emperor's presence on distant Terra. What he encountered during that journey would haunt him for the remainder of his existence, however long or short that might prove to be. Instead of the divine presence he had expected to find, Asmodai discovered that the psychic signature he had been following led not to Terra but to a region of the warp that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. The entities he encountered there greeted him as an expected visitor, welcoming him with the casual familiarity of old acquaintances. They revealed that the faith he had spent centuries nurturing and protecting was nothing more than an elaborate deception, and that his prayers had always been answered by powers that served purposes utterly opposed to everything he believed he stood for. When Asmodai's consciousness returned to his body, he brought with him knowledge that shattered the spiritual foundations upon which the chapter had been built. The Emperor, he reported, was either dead or so weakened that his influence could no longer reach his servants in any meaningful way. The entities that had been answering their prayers and granting them strength in battle were the same forces that were now demanding their open allegiance and service. Every ritual they had performed, every blessing they had received, had been provided by their enemies as part of a plan to gradually transform them into willing servants of chaos. This revelation completed the psychological destruction of the chapter's leadership structure. Faith, discipline, and loyalty to the Imperium had been the pillars upon which their identity was built, and all three had now been revealed as illusions maintained by the very forces they were supposedly fighting against. The innovations they had attempted in their desperation had not only failed to solve their problems, but had actually made their situation worse by demonstrating the hopelessness of conventional solutions. Chapter Master Amit, reviewing the catastrophic results of every attempt to address their crisis, was forced to acknowledge that the flesh tears had reached a point where no action they could take would restore their previous status as loyal servants of the Emperor. The corruption was too deep, too fundamental to their nature, and too well entrenched in their genetics and culture to be removed through any means at their disposal. They had become exactly what their enemies wanted them to be, and recognizing that fact was the first step toward understanding what choices remained available to them. The desperate innovations had revealed the true scope of their predicament, while eliminating any possibility of finding salvation through conventional means. The chapter stood at the threshold of a transformation that would determine not only their own fate, but potentially the fate of every world and every human life that had ever been touched by their influence. The time for half measures and desperate expedients had passed, and the final reckoning that would determine their ultimate allegiance was drawing inexorably closer. The revelation that shattered the last vestiges of the Flesh Tears' unity came not from external investigation or enemy action, but from within their own ranks. Brother Sergeant Kalar of the 6th Company, a veteran who had served the chapter faithfully for over 2 centuries, made a discovery that would force every warrior in the fortress monastery to confront the true nature of what they had become. While conducting routine maintenance in the deepest levels of the complex, areas that had been sealed since the original construction, Kalar found chambers that did not appear on any architectural plans or historical records. These hidden spaces contained artifacts and inscriptions that told a story completely at odds with the chapter's official history. Ancient stone tablets, carved with symbols that predated the Imperium by millennia, described rituals and practices that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the traditions the Flesh Tears had developed over their centuries of existence. More disturbing still were the preserved remains of what appeared to be Space Marines, their power armor bearing heraldry that matched the chapter's own colors and iconography despite being obviously far older than the chapter itself. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Either the Flesh Tears' traditions had been derived from sources that existed long before their founding, or their entire history had been fabricated to conceal connections to powers that should have been their enemies. Kalar's investigation revealed a network of hidden chambers throughout the fortress monastery, each containing evidence that the chapter's development had been guided by influences that were decidedly not aligned with Imperial interests. Chief Librarian Malakar, summoned to examine the psychic resonances of the discovered artifacts, confirmed what many had begun to suspect, but none had dared to voice openly. The items radiated signatures that were unmistakably associated with chaos worship, specifically the veneration of entities that fed on violence and bloodshed. More troubling still, the psychic traces suggested that these artifacts had been actively influencing the fortress monastery's environment for centuries, subtly shaping the thoughts and behavior of everyone who lived within its walls. The discovery of the hidden chambers coincided with a series of incidents that revealed the extent to which the chapter had already been compromised. Battle brothers who had shown no previous signs of corruption began to openly advocate for abandoning their loyalty to the Emperor in favor of serving what they described as the true masters of war. These warriors spoke with a conviction and certainty that suggested their conversion was not the result of recent influence, but rather the culmination of a process that had been underway for generations. Brother Captain Krendel found himself facing a situation that challenged every assumption he had made about command and loyalty. Warriors under his direct authority were not only questioning orders but actively working to subvert the chapter's remaining connections to Imperial doctrine. When he attempted to impose discipline through traditional means, he discovered that the corrupted battle brothers possessed knowledge of chapter protocols and security measures that should have been restricted to the highest levels of command. The realization that the corruption had penetrated the chapter's leadership structure became undeniable when Chapter Master Amit himself began to exhibit signs that his loyalty was no longer unquestionable. During a strategy meeting convened to address the growing crisis, Amit proposed solutions that would have required the chapter to openly break with Imperial authority and establish independent control over their operational area. His arguments were cogent and well-reasoned, but they were based on premises that assumed the Imperium was an obstacle to be overcome rather than an institution to be served. Chief Apothecary Voss, monitoring the biological and psychological profiles of the chapter's leadership, detected patterns that suggested systematic manipulation going back decades or possibly centuries. The senior officers showing signs of corruption were not random victims of recent influence, but individuals who had been carefully selected and gradually conditioned to serve as focal points for spreading that corruption throughout the chapter. Their positions of authority had made them ideal vectors for transmitting both conscious and unconscious influences to their subordinates. The scope of the betrayal became clear when encrypted communications were discovered, linking corrupted chapter members to external organizations that were known to be hostile to Imperial interests. These communications revealed that the flesh tiers had been sharing intelligence about Imperial military capabilities and strategic plans with entities that could only be described as enemies of mankind. Worse still, the communications indicated that this collaboration had been ongoing for far longer than anyone had suspected. Brother Chaplain Asmodai, still reeling from his traumatic psychic journey, found evidence that the chapter's spiritual practices had been systematically corrupted from their very inception. The litanies and prayers that formed the foundation of their faith had been subtly modified over the centuries, incorporating phrases and concepts that were designed to invoke the attention of malevolent warp entities rather than the Emperor's protection. Every ritual they had performed, every blessing they had received, had been serving purposes that were diametrically opposed to their stated beliefs. The corruption extended beyond mere spiritual matters to encompass the very essence of what it meant to be a space marine. Gene seed analysis revealed that the modifications the chapter had undergone were not random mutations, but deliberate alterations designed to make them more suitable servants for powers that valued aggression and brutality above all other qualities. Their enhanced physiology had been shaped to amplify their capacity for violence while reducing their ability to feel empathy or restraint. The discovery that their genetic heritage had been deliberately corrupted was perhaps the most devastating revelation of all, because it meant that the corruption was not something that had been imposed upon them, but rather something they had become through their own development. Every generation of flesh tiers had passed on genetic material that was slightly more corrupted than what they had received, creating a cumulative effect that had transformed them into something that was no longer entirely human. As the evidence of systematic betrayal mounted, the chapter began to fracture along lines that reflected different responses to the crisis they faced. Some battle brothers, horrified by the revelation of their true nature, demanded immediate action to purge the corruption from their ranks and restore their loyalty to the Emperor. Others argued that their transformation was inevitable, and that resisting it would only lead to unnecessary suffering and destruction. A third faction, led by warriors who had been most deeply affected by the corruption, openly embraced their new nature and called for the chapter to abandon any pretense of loyalty to the Imperium. These battle brothers argued that they had been liberated from the constraints and hypocrisy of Imperial doctrine, and that their true potential could only be realized by serving masters who appreciated their strength and hunger. The philosophical and tactical divisions within the chapter quickly escalated into open conflict as different factions attempted to impose their vision of the chapter's future. The fortress monastery became a battleground where space marines fought against their own brothers with the same savage intensity they had once reserved for the enemies of mankind. The very corridors that had echoed with prayers and oaths of loyalty now rang with the sounds of chain blades and bolt rounds as the chapter tore itself apart. Chapter Master Amit, recognizing that his authority was no longer sufficient to maintain unity, made a decision that would haunt him for whatever remained of his existence. Rather than attempting to impose a solution through force, he chose to allow the different factions to pursue their chosen paths independently. This decision effectively marked the end of the flesh tiers as a unified chapter, and the beginning of a civil war that would determine which version of their identity would ultimately survive. The Loyalist faction, led by Chief Apothecary Voss, and supported by those battle brothers who retained some connection to their original oaths, attempted to establish defensive positions in the upper levels of the fortress monastery. Their goal was to hold out long enough to contact Imperial authorities and request assistance in dealing with the corruption that had consumed their brothers. However, their communications equipment had been sabotaged by corrupted chapter members, leaving them isolated and facing an enemy that knew their capabilities and weaknesses intimately. The corrupted faction, openly led by warriors who had fully embraced their transformation, seized control of the chapter's armory and vehicle bays. Their strategy was to eliminate the Loyalist holdouts quickly, and then use the chapter's resources to establish independent control over Cretaceous and the surrounding systems. They possessed superior numbers and tactical advantages, but they also faced the challenge of fighting enemies who were as skilled and determined as themselves. The neutral faction, consisting of battle brothers who remained undecided about their ultimate allegiance, found themselves caught between two equally unacceptable alternatives. Fighting for the Loyalists would mean acknowledging that their entire existence had been based on a lie, and that everything they had accomplished was tainted by corruption. Supporting the corrupted would require them to openly betray oaths that had defined their identity for centuries. As the Civil War intensified, the true horror of the situation became apparent to observers on both sides. This was not a conflict between good and evil, loyalty and treachery, but rather a struggle between different interpretations of what the Flesh-Tears had become, and what they should do about it. All three factions were composed of warriors who had once served the Emperor faithfully, and all three were responding to the same impossible situation in ways that seemed reasonable from their respective perspectives. The fortress monastery itself began to show signs of the spiritual damage being inflicted by the conflict raging within its walls. Structural elements that had stood for centuries began to crack and shift without any apparent physical cause. Environmental systems failed in ways that created pockets of extreme temperature and atmospheric pressure that made entire sections of the complex uninhabitable. Most ominously, areas of the fortress began to exhibit gravitational anomalies and spatial distortions that suggested the intrusion of warp-based phenomena into real space. The Great Betrayal was not a single moment of treachery, but rather the culmination of a process that had been underway since the chapter's founding. Every choice they had made, every tradition they had developed, and every victory they had won had been part of a larger plan to transform them into something that served purposes opposed to everything they thought they believed in. The revelation of this truth had shattered their unity, and set them on a path toward mutual destruction that seemed to offer no possibility of redemption or salvation. As the Civil War raged through the corridors of their once sacred home, the surviving Flesh-Tears were forced to confront the possibility that their chapter's story would end not with glorious sacrifice and service to the Emperor, but with the pathetic spectacle of warriors destroying each other while their true enemies watched and laughed. The Great Betrayal had succeeded beyond the wildest expectations of those who had orchestrated it, and the final destruction of everything the chapter had once stood for was drawing inexorably closer. The civil war within the fortress monastery had been raging for 17 days when the first critical system failure occurred. The ancient plasma generators that had provided power to the complex for over 4 millennia began to exhibit fluctuations that the remaining Techmarines could not explain or correct. Brother Techmarine Vex, one of the few specialists who had remained loyal to the Imperium, discovered that the power distribution networks had been systematically sabotaged by corrupted chapter members who possessed intimate knowledge of the fortress's most sensitive systems. The sabotage was not random destruction, but rather a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to force the Loyalist defenders out of their strongholds while simultaneously preventing them from calling for outside assistance. Communications arrays were disabled through techniques that required years of specialized training to implement properly. Life support systems were modified to create atmospheric conditions that would be fatal to unaugmented humans while remaining tolerable for Space Marines, effectively eliminating the chapter serfs who might have provided intelligence about the fortress layout to potential Imperial rescue forces. Chief Apothecary Voss, coordinating the Loyalist defense from the chapter's primary medical facility, found himself facing challenges that no amount of training had prepared him to handle. The wounded warriors under his care were not merely suffering from conventional battle damage, but exhibiting symptoms that suggested exposure to toxins or pathogens that did not exist in any Imperial database. Some displayed signs of accelerated cellular breakdown that resembled the effects of exotic radiation, while others showed evidence of genetic modification that was occurring in real time as he attempted to treat them. More disturbing still were the reports from Loyalist scouts who had attempted to gather intelligence about corrupted positions in the lower levels of the fortress. These reconnaissance missions consistently ended with the scouts returning in states of psychological shock, claiming to have witnessed transformations and activities that challenged their understanding of what was physically possible. Battle brothers who had served alongside them for decades were described as having become something that was no longer recognizably human, despite retaining enough of their original appearance to be identifiable. The fortress monastery's internal architecture was beginning to change in ways that defied both physics and logic. Corridors that had maintained consistent dimensions for millennia were found to have expanded or contracted without any apparent cause. Rooms that scouts had mapped during previous reconnaissance attempts were discovered to have additional entrances that led to spaces not shown on any structural diagram. Most unsettling of all, Some areas of the complex seemed to exist in a state of constant flux, with their layout changing between visits in ways that made effective tactical planning impossible. Brother Captain Krendel, leading the Loyalist military response, was forced to abandon conventional tactics in favor of approaches that took into account the unpredictable nature of their battlefield. Traditional doctrines that emphasized control of key positions and secure lines of communication became meaningless when the positions themselves could change without warning, and communication was impossible over distances greater than a few dozen meters. His forces were reduced to operating in small independent units that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances but lacked the coordination necessary for major offensive operations. The corrupted faction, initially possessing significant advantages in terms of numbers and equipment, began to experience their own difficulties as the changes affecting the fortress monastery intensified. Their enhanced abilities and supernatural insights, which had made them formidable opponents during the early stages of the conflict, proved to be liabilities when dealing with an environment that was no longer governed by predictable physical laws. Warriors who had developed the ability to sense emotions and intentions found themselves overwhelmed by psychic emanations that came from sources they could not identify or understand. The neutral faction, caught between the two extremes, began to suffer casualties that exceeded those experienced by either of the active combatants. Battle brothers who had attempted to remain uninvolved in the conflict found themselves targeted by both sides, with loyalists viewing their neutrality as cowardice and corrupted warriors seeing their refusal to embrace transformation as a threat to be eliminated. More problematically, the spiritual and psychological stress of their situation was proving to be more damaging than physical combat, with many neutral warriors succumbing to forms of madness that rendered them incapable of making any decisions at all. The chapter's gene seed reserves, stored in the fortress monastery's most secure vaults, became a focal point for increasingly desperate actions by all three factions. The Loyalists recognized that preserving these genetic materials might be the only way to ensure that something of the chapter's original identity could survive the current crisis. The corrupted factions sought to claim the gene seed for purposes that they described only in terms that suggested rituals and transformations that would have been considered abhorrent under any circumstances. The neutral warriors viewed the gene seed as a potential bargaining chip that might allow them to negotiate some form of acceptable resolution to the conflict. The battle for control of the gene seed vaults resulted in the destruction of storage systems that had functioned flawlessly for over 4,000 years. Ancient preservation technologies, irreplaceable artifacts of the dark age of technology, were reduced to scrap metal and corrupted biological matter, as Space Marines fought with a ferocity that exceeded anything they had previously displayed against external enemies. The genetic heritage of the chapter, the living link that connected them to their Primarch and the Emperor himself, was scattered and contaminated in ways that made recovery impossible. Brother Chaplain Asmodai, witnessing the destruction of materials that represented the spiritual and biological foundation of everything he had dedicated his existence to protecting, experienced a psychological breakdown that manifested in ways that terrified even his corrupted enemies. His enhanced physiology, already strained by the revelations he had experienced during his psychic journey, began to exhibit signs of transformation that seemed to combine the worst aspects of both loyalty and corruption. He became a living embodiment of the contradictions that had destroyed his chapter, displaying supernatural abilities that served no comprehensible purpose and spouting theological arguments that made sense to no one, including himself. The fortress monastery's external defenses, designed to protect against invasion by conventional enemies, proved to be completely inadequate for containing the forces that were now active within the complex. Void shields that could deflect orbital bombardment flickered and failed when exposed to emanations that originated from the conflicts raging in the deepest levels of the structure. Weapon systems that had never failed in millennia of service began to fire on their own operators, or simply exploded without apparent cause. The failure of the external defenses had implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Cretacea's native population, already traumatized by centuries of exposure to the flesh-tearers' methods, began to experience phenomena that suggested the corruption affecting the Space Marines was spreading to encompass the entire planetary ecosystem. Livestock developed mutations that resembled those observed in corrupted chapter members, while vegetation began to exhibit growth patterns that served no evolutionary purpose but created formations that resembled the ritual arrangements found in the hidden chambers beneath the fortress. Reports from other worlds in the system indicated that the corruption was not confined to Cretaceous itself, but was manifesting wherever the flesh tears had established a significant presence. Imperial Guard regiments trained using the chapter's methods were experiencing discipline problems that escalated into full-scale mutinies. Planetary governments that had implemented policies based on the doctrine of controlled savagery found themselves facing uprisings that combined conventional rebellion with elements that could only be described as supernatural. The cascade of failures affecting the chapter's sphere of influence attracted the attention of Imperial authorities who had previously been content to allow the flesh tearers to operate with minimal oversight. Battle fleets from 3 different Space Marine chapters converged on the Cretaceous system, their commanders having received reports that suggested a threat to Imperial security that might require extreme measures to contain. The arrival of these forces marked the end of any possibility that the crisis could be resolved internally or concealed from the broader Imperium. Chapter Master Amit, observing the destruction of everything he had spent centuries building, made a decision that would define his legacy and determine the ultimate fate of his chapter. Rather than attempting to negotiate with the approaching Imperial forces, or seeking some form of accommodation that might preserve a portion of his warriors, he chose to activate the fortress monastery's self-destruct systems. This decision was motivated not by despair or spite, but by a clear understanding that the corruption affecting his chapter was too dangerous to be allowed to spread beyond Cretaceous. The activation of the self-destruct sequence required codes and authorization from multiple senior officers, a safeguard designed to prevent exactly the kind of situation that was now unfolding. However, the Civil War had eliminated most of the officers who might have opposed Amit's decision, and those who remained were either too damaged to understand the implications of their actions, or too desperate to care about the consequences. The ancient mechanisms designed to completely obliterate the fortress monastery in the event of catastrophic compromise began their irreversible countdown. The remaining loyalist forces, informed of Amit's decision through encrypted communications that somehow penetrated the interference affecting other systems, faced a choice that epitomized the tragic nature of their situation. They could attempt to evacuate the fortress and preserve what remained of their chapter's loyal elements, or they could remain to ensure that the corrupted faction was completely eliminated regardless of the cost to themselves. The majority chose to remain, viewing their sacrifice as the last service they could perform for the emperor they had served so faithfully. The corrupted faction, detecting the activation of the self-destruct systems through means that suggested supernatural perception, began a desperate attempt to reach the fortress monastery's landing bays and escape before the detonation occurred. Their enhanced abilities and willingness to employ any means necessary gave them significant advantages in the race against time, but they were hampered by the same environmental instabilities that had plagued all movement within the complex. Some reached their objectives and managed to board functional spacecraft, while others were trapped by spatial distortions that deposited them in areas of the fortress that existed outside normal space-time. As the countdown entered its final phase, the fortress monastery began to exhibit phenomena that suggested the barrier between real space and the warp was breaking down completely. Areas of the complex became accessible to entities that should not have been able to manifest in the material universe, while other sections seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Civil War that had begun as a conflict between different interpretations of loyalty and duty was ending as a battle between forces that represented fundamental aspects of order and chaos. The final moments before detonation were marked by a strange calm that settled over the surviving combatants. Loyalists and corrupted alike seemed to recognize that their individual conflicts had become irrelevant in the face of forces that dwarfed their personal concerns. Some used these last moments to attempt reconciliation with former brothers, while others spent them in prayer or meditation. A few simply stood and watched as the walls around them began to dissolve, waiting for the end with the stoic acceptance that had always characterized the Space Marines in the face of impossible odds. The cascade of failures that had destroyed the flesh tearers represented more than the collapse of a single chapter. It was a demonstration of how corruption could transform servants of the Emperor into enemies of everything they had once protected, and how the very strength and independence that made Space Marines effective could become vulnerabilities when that corruption reached critical mass. The approaching Imperial fleets would find a world scarred by forces that challenged their understanding of what was possible, and the survivors of the disaster would carry with them knowledge that would influence Imperial policy for millennia to come. The arrival of the Imperial Relief Force had been anticipated by Chapter Master Amit for weeks, their approach detected by the few functioning Auspex arrays that remained operational despite the chaos consuming his fortress monastery. Leading this intervention was Captain Erasmus Tycho of the Blood Angels 3rd Company, accompanied by elements from the Imperial Fists and a full company of Grey Knights, whose presence indicated that the highest levels of Imperial authority viewed the situation as a potential demonic incursion requiring immediate and decisive action. Captain Tycho had served alongside the Flesh-Tearers during the Armageddon campaigns, and retained both respect and affection for warriors he had once considered brothers in all but name. However, the reports he had received during his journey to Cretaceous painted a picture so disturbing that he found himself questioning whether anything of the chapter he remembered could possibly survive what they had become. The possibility that he might be forced to order the destruction of an entire successor chapter weighed heavily on his mind as his strike cruiser entered orbit around the Death World. The first indication that the situation exceeded even the most pessimistic projections came when the Imperial fleet attempted to establish communications with the Fortress Monastery. Instead of the disciplined responses they expected from Space Marine operators, their transmissions were answered by voices that spoke in harmonics and frequencies that caused physical pain to unprotected listeners. The words themselves were recognizable as Gothic, but they were arranged in patterns that seemed designed to convey meanings beyond the surface content, creating an unsettling effect that left even veteran Astartes feeling disoriented and disturbed. Brother Captain Sandini of the Grey Knights, monitoring these communications through psychically warded equipment, detected emanations that confirmed his worst fears about the nature of the threat they faced. The Fortress Monastery was not merely compromised by chaos influence, but had become a focal point for warp manifestations that threatened to tear open a permanent rift between real space and the Imperium. The corruption affecting the Flesh-Tearers had progressed beyond individual transformation to encompass their entire operational area, creating conditions that could potentially spread across multiple star systems if left unchecked. The decision to deploy ground forces rather than simply conducting orbital bombardment was made after careful consideration of the strategic implications. The knowledge and equipment contained within the Fortress Monastery, if corrupted rather than destroyed, could provide enemies of the Imperium with insights into Space Marine capabilities, and Imperial military doctrine that would compromise operations throughout the sector. More importantly, intelligence suggested that loyalist elements within the chapter might still be holding defensive positions, and their rescue could provide valuable information about how the corruption had spread, and how it might be prevented in future incidents. The initial landing was accomplished without significant resistance, though the environmental conditions on Cretaceous had deteriorated dramatically since the last Imperial visit. The planet's atmosphere contained particulates and gases that did not appear in any previous surveys, while the gravitational field exhibited fluctuations that made precise navigation extremely difficult. Most disturbing were the biological readings that indicated the presence of life forms that combined human and Xenos characteristics in ways that suggested deliberate genetic manipulation rather than natural evolution. Captain Tycho led the primary assault force, consisting of 2 full companies of Blood Angels, supported by specialized units equipped for operating in contaminated environments. Their objective was to establish a secure perimeter around the Fortress Monastery, and then conduct a systematic search for loyalist survivors, while gathering intelligence about the extent of the corruption. The Grey Knights would provide psychic support and deal with any supernatural manifestations that exceeded conventional military capabilities. The first contact with corrupted Flesh-Tearers occurred less than an hour after planetfall, when a patrol encountered what appeared to be a routine reconnaissance force investigating the Imperial landing site. The engagement that followed challenged every assumption the Blood Angels had made about their genetic brothers and their capabilities. The corrupted Space Marines moved with speed and coordination that exceeded normal Astartes parameters, while their weapons and equipment had been modified in ways that suggested access to technological resources that should not have been available to a single chapter. More troubling than their enhanced capabilities was their apparent knowledge of Blood Angels' tactical doctrine and individual command personnel. The corrupted warriors addressed Captain Tycho by name and demonstrated familiarity with his service record and personal history that could only have come from detailed intelligence files. They spoke of shared battles and common heritage while simultaneously attempting to kill him and his warriors with methods that seemed designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma rather than achieving efficient military objectives. The assault on the Fortress Monastery proper began at dawn on the second day, with Blood Angels strike forces approaching from multiple directions, while Grey Knights established psychic containment around the entire complex. The ancient walls that had once provided protection against conventional enemies proved to be no obstacle to attackers equipped with modern siege equipment. but the defenders had advantages that transcended mere fortification. The very architecture of the fortress seemed to work against the Imperial forces, with corridors shifting to create kill zones and chambers sealing themselves to trap advancing units. Brother Chaplain Grimaldus, of the Imperial Fists, serving as spiritual advisor to the assault force, reported experiencing phenomena during the breach that challenged his understanding of the relationship between faith and reality. Prayers that had sustained him through centuries of warfare seemed to lose their power within the fortress walls, while the sacred litanies that normally provided protection against chaos influence appeared to have the opposite effect. Most disturbing of all, he began to hear responses to his invocations that came from sources other than the Emperor, suggesting that the corruption had somehow altered the spiritual environment within the complex. The discovery of Loyalist survivors came during the assault on the fortress's central keep, when Blood Angel's forces breached what appeared to be a heavily fortified position only to find it occupied by flesh-tearers who had maintained their allegiance to the Imperium. Chief Apothecary Voss, leading a group of fewer than 50 battle brothers, had been defending this position for weeks against attacks from their corrupted brothers while attempting to preserve what remained of the chapter's sacred relics and gene seed stocks. The condition of these Loyalist survivors provided shocking evidence of what the Civil War had cost both sides. Veterans who had served for centuries showed signs of physical and psychological trauma that went far beyond the effects of conventional combat. They spoke in whispers about horrors they had witnessed, describing transformations and betrayals that had shattered their understanding of brotherhood and loyalty. Most tragically, several showed early signs of the same corruption that had consumed their enemies, suggesting that mere exposure to the tainted environment was sufficient to begin the process of transformation. Voss himself had been conducting a desperate rearguard action not just against corrupted battle brothers, but against the fortress monastery's own systems, which had somehow been turned against the Loyalist defenders. Life support equipment delivered toxins instead of breathable atmosphere, while communication arrays broadcast psychic emanations that induced hallucinations and violent episodes among anyone who attempted to use them. The chief apothecary had been forced to jury-rig medical equipment to maintain life support for his wounded warriors, while simultaneously treating conditions that no Imperial medical doctrine had prepared him to handle. The intelligence that Voss provided to Captain Tycho painted a picture of corruption that was both more extensive and more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. The transformation of the flesh-tearers had not been a sudden event but rather the culmination of a process that had been underway since their founding, guided by entities that possessed intimate knowledge of Space Marine psychology and Imperial military doctrine. The corrupted faction had not simply fallen to chaos but had been deliberately molded into weapons designed to inflict maximum damage on Imperial institutions and personnel. The final assault on the corrupted strongholds in the fortress's lower levels required the combined efforts of all three Imperial forces, with Blood Angels providing assault troops, Imperial Fists contributing siege specialists, and Grey Knights dealing with the supernatural aspects of the resistance they encountered. The battles that followed were unlike anything in the extensive combat experience of any participant, featuring enemies who combined Space Marine capabilities with abilities that seemed to derive from sources beyond the material universe. The corrupted flesh-tearers fought with a coordination and tactical sophistication that suggested they were receiving guidance from intelligence sources that could anticipate Imperial moves before they were made. Their weapons and equipment incorporated technologies that appeared to be based on principles that violated established laws of physics, while their battle brothers displayed capabilities that exceeded the normal limits of even enhanced human physiology. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be able to corrupt Imperial equipment and personnel through methods that worked too quickly to be countered by conventional protective measures. Brother Captain Sandini and his Grey Knights found themselves fighting battles on multiple levels simultaneously, engaging enemies in both real space and the warp while attempting to maintain psychic containment around manifestations that threatened to break through into the material universe. The psychic emanations from the corrupted strongholds were affecting not just the immediate combat area but the entire planetary system, with reports coming in of strange phenomena occurring on worlds that were light years away from Cretaceous. The turning point came when Imperial forces discovered the chamber that housed Chapter Master Amit, who had remained in the fortress's command center throughout the Civil War and the subsequent Imperial assault. The ancient warrior was found connected to the fortress's control systems through neural interfaces that appeared to have fused with his enhanced physiology, making it impossible to determine where the man ended and the machine began. His consciousness seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple states, allowing him to coordinate defensive efforts while also monitoring the self-destruct sequence that he had activated days earlier. Amit's final communication to Captain Tycho was delivered through speakers that had been damaged beyond normal function, but somehow continued to operate despite their physical condition. The chapter master expressed no regret for the path his warriors had followed, arguing that they had simply embraced their true nature rather than continuing to serve masters who valued them only as tools for destruction. He described the corruption as a form of evolution that had freed his chapter from the constraints and hypocrisy of Imperial doctrine, allowing them to achieve their full potential as the ultimate predators in a galaxy where only strength mattered. The conversation between the two Space Marine leaders, conducted while battles raged throughout the fortress around them, represented more than just a military negotiation. It was a theological and philosophical debate about the nature of loyalty, duty, and the purpose of the Space Marines themselves. Tycho argued that service to the Emperor represented the highest calling that any warrior could achieve, while Amit countered that such service was merely slavery disguised as honor, preventing the Space Marines from realizing their true potential as the next stage of human evolution. The debate was ended not by either participant reaching a conclusion, but by the activation of the Fortress Monastery's final self-destruct protocols. Amit had designed the system to operate in stages, with initial explosions intended to eliminate the corrupted strongholds while giving Loyalist forces time to evacuate. However, the damage to the fortress's control systems meant that the sequence was no longer operating according to its original programming, threatening to engulf the entire complex in a detonation that would eliminate everyone within its walls regardless of their allegiance. The evacuation that followed was a running battle through corridors that were collapsing around the retreating forces, with Imperial and Loyalist flesh-tearers fighting side by side against corrupted warriors who seemed determined to prevent anyone from escaping the destruction they had brought upon themselves. The final moments within the fortress were marked by acts of heroism and sacrifice that demonstrated both the nobility and the tragedy of the Space Marine ideal, as warriors who had once been brothers gave their lives to ensure that something of their heritage might survive the catastrophe they had created. Captain Tycho was among the last to leave the fortress, carrying with him both the gene seed samples that Chief Apothecary Voss had preserved, and the knowledge that would shape Imperial policy toward potentially corrupted Space Marine chapters for millennia to come. As his transport lifted off from the collapsing structure, he watched the final detonation that erased 4,000 years of history and tradition, leaving only questions about how such a transformation could have occurred, and whether it could happen again to other chapters facing similar pressures and temptations. The silence that followed the destruction of the Flesh-Tearers Fortress Monastery was more unsettling than the explosions that had preceded it. Captain Tycho stood on the bridge of his strike cruiser, watching through reinforced viewports as the massive detonation sent shockwaves through Cretaceous atmosphere, creating storm patterns that would persist for decades. The mountain that had housed 4 millennia of Space Marine history was simply gone, replaced by a crater that glowed with residual energy signatures that his ship's sensors could not properly classify. In the medical bays below, Chief Apothecary Voss and 47 other Loyalist survivors were undergoing extensive decontamination and psychological evaluation procedures that had been hastily adapted from protocols designed for dealing with chaos exposure. The Blood Angels medical staff found themselves confronting conditions they had no training to address, treating warriors whose enhanced physiology showed signs of corruption that went beyond mere spiritual taint to encompass fundamental alterations to their genetic structure. The immediate priority was determining which of the survivors could be safely integrated into Imperial forces, and which represented ongoing threats that required permanent containment. This assessment process was complicated by the fact that the corruption affecting the Flesh-Tearers had proven capable of spreading through means that were not yet fully understood, making every interaction with the survivors a potential vector for further contamination. Brother Apothecary Corbulo of the Blood Angels found himself working alongside specialists from the Grey Knights to develop screening procedures that could detect corruption levels below the threshold of obvious manifestation. Brother Captain Sandini's preliminary report to his chapter's leadership painted a picture of corruption that challenged established understanding of how chaos influence operated within Space Marine organizations. The entities responsible for the Flesh-Tearers transformation had demonstrated patience and subtlety that exceeded anything previously documented, working through multiple generations to achieve their objectives, while avoiding detection by even the most sophisticated monitoring systems. The implications for other chapters, particularly those with genetic flaws or unusual recruitment practices, were staggering. The political ramifications of the incident began to manifest even before the rescue fleet had departed Cretaceous orbit. The High Lords of Terra demanded immediate and detailed reports about how an entire Space Marine chapter could fall to corruption without triggering the safeguards supposedly built into the Imperial military structure. The Inquisition initiated investigations into every organization that had interacted with the Flesh-Tearers over the previous millennium, seeking to identify other potential vectors for the same type of gradual subversion. Chief Apothecary Voss, despite his own precarious position as a survivor of a corrupted chapter, found himself serving as the primary source of intelligence about how the transformation had occurred, and what warning signs other Imperial authorities should monitor. His debriefings revealed the extent to which the corruption had been able to masquerade as acceptable variations in chapter culture and doctrine, making detection extremely difficult even for trained observers who knew what to look for. The gene seed samples that Voss had preserved became the focus of intensive research efforts aimed at understanding how genetic corruption could be prevented or detected in its early stages. Analysis revealed that the taint affecting the Flesh-Tearers had been present in their genetic material from the very beginning of their existence as an independent chapter, but had been so subtle that it had not manifested in ways that triggered standard purity protocols. This discovery forced a fundamental reevaluation of gene seed monitoring procedures throughout the Imperium. The surviving Loyalist battle brothers faced a future that was both uncertain and limited by the circumstances of their rescue. None of them could be assigned to active duty without extensive rehabilitation that might take decades to complete, if it was possible at all. The psychological trauma they had experienced during the Civil War was compounded by the knowledge that their entire chapter history had been built on a foundation of corruption, making it extremely difficult for them to maintain any sense of identity or purpose. Several of the survivors requested permission to undergo the ritual of redemption through death, preferring to end their existence rather than live with the knowledge of what they had become, and what they had been party to during their service with the chapter. These requests were initially denied by Imperial authorities who valued the intelligence they could provide. But the psychological deterioration of battle brothers who were prevented from seeking their preferred form of absolution eventually forced a reconsideration of this policy. The worlds that had been influenced by Flesh-Tearers' doctrine experienced varying degrees of instability in the aftermath of the chapter's destruction. Some planetary governments attempted to distance themselves from methods they had previously embraced, implementing reforms designed to eliminate practices that might have been tainted by the same corruption that had consumed the Space Marines. Others argued that the effectiveness of these methods was independent of their origin, and that abandoning them would leave their worlds vulnerable to threats that conventional Imperial doctrine was inadequate to address. The Imperial Guard regiments that had been trained using Flesh-Tearers methods posed a more immediate problem, as many showed signs of the same psychological instability that had affected the Space Marines themselves. Commissars reported increasing incidents of unauthorized violence and insubordination among troops who had once been model soldiers, while regimental commanders struggled to maintain discipline using conventional methods that seemed ineffective against the mindset that had been deliberately cultivated in their subordinates. Inquisitor Chorus' investigation into the broader implications of the Flesh-Tearers' corruption revealed connections to heretical organizations and chaos cults throughout the sector that had not been previously suspected. The chapter's influence had created opportunities for subversion that extended far beyond their immediate operational area, with some worlds showing evidence of corruption that predated any direct contact with the Space Marines by decades or even centuries. The theological implications of the Flesh-Tearers' fall were perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire incident for Imperial authorities charged with maintaining the spiritual health of the Imperium. The fact that warriors who had genuinely believed themselves to be serving the Emperor had been manipulated into becoming weapons against everything they thought they protected raised questions about the reliability of faith itself as a safeguard against corruption. Brother Chaplain Grimaldus found himself tasked with developing new spiritual protocols that could detect and counter the type of gradual subversion that had destroyed the Flesh-Tearers. This effort required him to confront the possibility that traditional methods of maintaining faith and loyalty might be inadequate against enemies who possess centuries or millennia to work their influence on potential victims. The challenge was developing approaches that could strengthen resistance to corruption without becoming so rigid that they interfered with the flexibility and initiative that made Space Marines effective. The destruction of the fortress monastery had eliminated the immediate threat posed by the corrupted flesh-tearers, but it had also destroyed evidence that might have provided insights into how such corruption could be prevented in future cases. The research facilities and archives that had contained millennia of data about the chapter's development were reduced to radioactive ash, taking with them information that could have been invaluable for protecting other organizations facing similar threats. Captain Tycho's own response to the events on Cretacia reflected the broader struggle that many Imperial officials experienced when confronting the implications of what they had witnessed. The corruption that had destroyed the flesh-tearers was not the result of obvious weakness or clear moral failure, but rather the culmination of influences that had worked through channels that were virtually undetectable until they reached critical mass. This realization forced him to question assumptions about his own chapter's security and the reliability of safeguards that he had previously taken for granted. The survivors who were eventually cleared for limited service found themselves scattered throughout the Imperium, assigned to organizations where their expertise could be valuable, while their isolation minimized the risk of spreading any residual corruption they might carry. Chief Apothecary Voss was transferred to the Death Watch, where his knowledge of genetic corruption could be applied to studying Xenos biological warfare techniques. Other survivors were assigned to training positions where they could share their hard-won understanding of how to recognize and resist subversion. The Blood Angels chapter, as the parent organization of the fallen successors, bore a particular burden of responsibility for the disaster that had befallen their genetic descendants. Chapter Master Dante ordered a comprehensive review of all Blood Angel successor chapters, implementing new monitoring protocols designed to detect the early signs of the type of gradual corruption that had destroyed the flesh-tearers. This effort required delicate diplomacy, as many successor chapters viewed such oversight as an infringement on their independence and a questioning of their loyalty. The long-term impact of the flesh-tearers incident on Imperial military doctrine was profound, leading to changes in how Space Marine chapters were monitored and supported that would influence operations for millennia to come. The assumption that genetic brothers could be trusted to police themselves was replaced by systems that required external validation of chapter purity on a regular basis. These changes were not universally welcomed, as many chapters viewed them as excessive interference in their internal affairs. The crater that marked the site of the former fortress monastery became a place of pilgrimage for Imperial officials seeking to understand how such a catastrophe could have been prevented. The psychic emanations from the destruction site continued to affect sensitive individuals for years after the explosion, with some visitors reporting visions of events that had occurred during the chapter's final days. These phenomena were eventually contained through the efforts of Grey Knight specialists, but not before they had provided disturbing insights into the nature of the corruption that had consumed the flesh-tearers. As the immediate crisis response phase concluded, and the surviving Imperial forces departed Cretacea's system, the full scope of what had been lost became apparent to those who had known the flesh-tearers during their millennia of service. 4,000 years of accumulated tradition, knowledge, and combat experience had been erased in a matter of hours, taking with it insights and capabilities that could never be recovered or replaced. The galaxy was a dimmer place for their absence, even as their destruction had potentially prevented a catastrophe that could have affected entire sectors. The destruction of the flesh-tearers reverberated through Imperial institutions for centuries, fundamentally altering how the Imperium approached the delicate balance between Space Marine independence and institutional oversight. The Codex Astartes, that sacred text which had governed Space Marine organizations since the second founding, required unprecedented amendments to address vulnerabilities that had been exposed by the chapter's gradual corruption and spectacular fall. Within the halls of Terra's administrative palaces, the High Lords found themselves confronting a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond military considerations. If an entire Space Marine chapter could fall to corruption while maintaining the appearance of loyalty for millennia, what other institutions might be compromised in ways that remained undetected? The paranoia that followed the flesh-tearers incident led to the establishment of new oversight bodies and monitoring protocols that would reshape Imperial governance for the remainder of the 41st millennium. The Ordo Astartes, a previously minor branch of the Inquisition that had focused primarily on investigating individual Space Marines suspected of heresy, was dramatically expanded and given authority to conduct regular inspections of entire chapters. These inspections went far beyond the traditional review of combat records and gene seed purity to encompass psychological evaluation of chapter leadership, analysis of recruitment practices, and detailed examination of chapter culture and traditions for signs of gradual deviation from imperial norms. The implementation of these new oversight measures was met with resistance from many Space Marine chapters who viewed them as an unwarranted intrusion into their ancient prerogatives and a questioning of their fundamental loyalty to the Emperor. The Imperial Fists, despite their own participation in the relief operation at Cretaceous, formally protested the implication that they required external monitoring to maintain their dedication to duty. The Space Wolves went further, refusing to cooperate with Inquisition inspectors and threatening to treat such visits as hostile actions. This resistance led to the Inquisition Wars of M37, a series of conflicts that saw several Space Marine chapters openly defying Imperial authority rather than submitting to what they considered humiliating and unnecessary scrutiny. These wars demonstrated that the cure for potential corruption could be as damaging as the disease itself, as loyal chapters were driven to rebellion by measures intended to prevent exactly such departures from imperial orthodoxy. The Blood Angels bore a particular burden in the aftermath of their successor chapter's destruction, as genetic analysis of the flesh-tearers' corruption revealed connections to flaws that were present throughout Sanguinius's bloodline. The Red Thirst and Black Rage, conditions that had been manageable if troubling aspects of Blood Angel's heritage, were suddenly viewed as potential vectors for the same type of gradual subversion that had destroyed the flesh-tearers. Chapter Master Dante found himself defending not only his own chapter's loyalty, but the continued existence of all Blood Angel successors, as some Imperial authorities argued that the entire gene line should be declared corrupted beyond redemption. The political and military crisis that followed required intervention from the highest levels of the Imperial hierarchy to resolve, ultimately establishing precedents for how genetic flaws would be evaluated and managed throughout the Space Marine program. The research conducted into the nature of the flesh-tearers' corruption yielded technological and medical advances that proved valuable in other contexts, even as they revealed disturbing truths about the vulnerability of enhanced human biology to sophisticated manipulation. Techniques developed for detecting gradual genetic drift were adapted for use in monitoring other Imperial organizations, while methods for psychic screening of potentially corrupted individuals found applications in recruitment for the Imperial Guard and Adeptus Arbites. Perhaps most significantly, the incident forced a fundamental reconsideration of the relationship between the Emperor's divine nature and the protection it supposedly provided to his servants. The fact that warriors who had genuinely believed themselves to be serving the Emperor could be gradually turned into weapons against the Imperium challenged theological assumptions that had remained unquestioned since the Great Crusade. This crisis of faith led to reforms within the ecclesiarchy that emphasized personal vigilance and constant self-examination, rather than relying solely on divine protection. The worlds that had been influenced by flesh-tearers' doctrine experienced decades of political and social instability, as they struggled to determine which practices should be retained and which abandoned. Some, like Mordian 7, underwent complete governmental restructuring that eliminated all traces of the chapter's influence, even when doing so required significant economic and military sacrifices. Others attempted to preserve the effective elements of what they had learned while discarding aspects that were now understood to be potentially corrupting. The Imperial Guard regiments that had been trained using flesh-tearers' methods posed ongoing challenges that required innovative solutions from military administrators throughout the sector. Many of these units retained their enhanced combat effectiveness while showing signs of psychological instability that made them unsuitable for standard deployment patterns. Specialized commands were established to utilize these forces against enemies where their particular characteristics would be advantageous while minimizing the risk they posed to friendly forces and civilian populations. The Scala Progenium, that vital institution responsible for training future Imperial leaders, underwent comprehensive reforms designed to eliminate any curriculum elements that might have been derived from corrupted sources. The process of identifying and removing these influences proved to be extraordinarily complex, as the flesh-tearers' doctrine had been integrated into established teaching methods over the course of several centuries. The resulting disruption to standard training programs created shortages of qualified personnel that affected Imperial operations across multiple sectors for decades. The technological legacy of the flesh-tearers proved to be as problematic as their doctrinal influence, as equipment and weapons developed using their research methods required extensive testing to determine whether they contained hidden vulnerabilities or corruptive influences. Some innovations, such as their enhanced power armor restraint systems, were adopted throughout the Imperial military after appropriate modifications. Others, particularly those involving biological or psychic components, were declared too dangerous for continued use and ordered destroyed wherever they were discovered. The fortress monastery's destruction had eliminated most physical evidence of how the corruption had operated. But archaeologists and tech adepts continued to study the blast site for decades, hoping to recover information that might prevent similar incidents. These investigations revealed that the corruption had affected not just the chapter's personnel and equipment but the very matter of which their stronghold was constructed, creating structural changes that persisted even after the facility's destruction. The psychic resonances detected at the former fortress site attracted the attention of scholars studying the relationship between warp phenomena and physical reality. Their research contributed to advances in understanding how chaos corruption could affect material objects and environments, leading to improved methods for detecting and countering such influences. However, this research also revealed the extent to which the corruption had spread beyond the chapter itself, with traces detectable on worlds that had never hosted Flesh-Tear's forces. The diplomatic consequences of the incident extended throughout the sector and beyond. As planetary governments and military commands struggled to determine how much of their previous cooperation with the chapter had been legitimate, and how much had served the purposes of their corruptors, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and cultural exchanges that had been based on trust in the chapter's integrity required renegotiation or outright cancellation. The economic disruption caused by these changes contributed to instability that persisted for centuries. The surviving loyalist Flesh-Tears scattered throughout Imperial service became focal points for ongoing research into how corruption could be detected and prevented. Their experiences provided invaluable insights into the psychological and spiritual pressures that had gradually transformed their brothers, while their continued dedication to Imperial service demonstrated that redemption was possible even for those who had been exposed to the most sophisticated forms of subversion. Chief Apothecary Voss's work with the Death Watch proved particularly valuable, as his knowledge of how corruption could masquerade as acceptable variation helped identify similar patterns among xeno-species that utilized biological warfare techniques. His research contributed to the development of new protective protocols that were adopted throughout the Imperial military, potentially preventing countless future incidents of corruption and infiltration. The incident's impact on Space Marine recruitment practices was profound, as chapters throughout the Imperium were forced to reevaluate their selection criteria and training methods to minimize the risk of accepting candidates who might be vulnerable to gradual corruption. The traditional emphasis on physical prowess and genetic compatibility was supplemented by psychological screening techniques designed to identify potential weaknesses that could be exploited by sophisticated enemies. The creation of the Monument to Eternal Vigilance on Cretaceous Moon served both as a memorial to the loyalist Flesh-Tearers who had died fighting their corrupted brothers, and as a reminder to future generations of the constant threat posed by enemies who could work through patience and subtlety, rather than obvious force. The monument became a site of pilgrimage for Imperial officials seeking to understand the nature of the threats they faced and the price of complacency in confronting them. The academic study of the Flesh-Tearers incident became a field in its own right, with scholars throughout the Imperium analyzing every aspect of the chapter's history for lessons that could be applied to preventing similar occurrences. These studies revealed patterns of gradual change that had been invisible to contemporary observers, but were obvious in retrospect, leading to the development of new analytical tools for detecting institutional drift before it reached critical levels. The legal precedents established by the response to the Flesh-Tearers' corruption influenced Imperial jurisprudence for millennia, creating frameworks for dealing with organizations that had been compromised through no fault of their current membership. The balance between protecting innocent individuals and preventing the spread of corruption required careful consideration of factors that had never been addressed by previous legal scholarship. The psychological impact of the incident on surviving Imperial personnel who had served alongside the Flesh-Tearers created a generation of leaders who approached security concerns with a level of paranoia that sometimes proved counterproductive. The challenge of maintaining necessary vigilance without allowing suspicion to paralyze effective governance became a central theme of Imperial administration throughout the subsequent millennium. The Flesh-Tearers' destruction marked the end of an era in Imperial military doctrine, concluding a period when Space Marine chapters could operate with minimal oversight and establishing a new paradigm that emphasized transparency and accountability even at the cost of operational flexibility. The galaxy that emerged from this transformation was more secure in some ways, but had lost a measure of the independence and initiative that had made the Space Marines such effective defenders of humanity. In the closing years of the 41st millennium, as Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade tears through the galaxy and the Great Rift splits the Imperium in two, the legacy of the Flesh-Tearers has taken on new significance that few could have anticipated during those dark days on Cretacia. The lessons learned from their fall and the institutions created in response to their corruption have proven invaluable in confronting threats that dwarf even the catastrophe that consumed an entire Space Marine chapter. The return of Robout Guilliman to active leadership of the Imperium brought with it a comprehensive review of the reforms implemented following the Flesh-Tearers incident. The Primarch's perspective, informed by his experience during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, provided insights into how gradual corruption could affect even the most loyal servants of the Emperor. His assessment of the safeguards developed over the intervening millennia was both sobering and encouraging, revealing strengths and weaknesses that had not been apparent to those who had designed them. The Ultima Founding, Guilliman's ambitious program to create new Space Marine chapters using improved gene seed and enhanced implantation procedures, incorporated lessons learned from the Flesh-Tearers' corruption into its fundamental design principles. The new chapters were organized with redundant oversight mechanisms and psychological screening procedures that drew directly from research conducted in the aftermath of the Cretacia incident. More significantly, the Primaris Marines created through Belisarius Cahl's innovations possessed genetic modifications specifically designed to resist the type of gradual subversion that had destroyed their predecessors. Yet even as these improvements were implemented, new discoveries emerged that challenged assumptions about what had actually happened to the Flesh-Tearers, and whether their destruction had truly eliminated the threat they represented. Archaeological expeditions to worlds that had been influenced by the chapter's doctrine uncovered evidence suggesting that their corruption had spread far beyond anything previously documented, creating networks of influence that persisted long after the chapter itself had been eliminated. The most significant of these discoveries occurred on the Forge world of Lucius, where tech adepts conducting routine maintenance in ancient data storage facilities found archives containing detailed records of interactions with the Flesh-Tearers that predated the chapter's official founding by several centuries. These records described exchanges of technology and personnel that should have been impossible given the established timeline of the chapter's existence, suggesting either massive errors in Imperial historical records or the presence of forces that had been manipulating events across far longer timescales than anyone had imagined. Brother Captain Cardan Stranos of the Iron Hands, leading the investigation into these anomalous records, discovered patterns of influence that extended throughout the Mechanicus hierarchy on multiple Forge worlds. The technology exchanges documented in the ancient archives had introduced design principles and manufacturing techniques that bore subtle but unmistakable similarities to equipment found in the ruins of the Flesh-Tearers' fortress monastery. Analysis revealed that these influences had been gradually shaping Mechanicus development for millennia, potentially affecting everything from weapon design to strategic planning across hundreds of organizations. The implications of these discoveries forced a fundamental reconsideration of how long the corruption affecting the Flesh-Tearers had been developing, and whether their destruction had truly eliminated its source. If the influences responsible for their transformation had been operating across multiple millennia and affecting institutions throughout the Imperium, then the crater on Cretacia represented not the end of the threat, but merely the elimination of its most visible manifestation. Chief Apothecary Voss, now serving his third century with the Death Watch and bearing the accumulated wisdom of decades spent studying corruption in all its forms, provided crucial insights into how such long-term manipulation could operate without detection. His research had revealed that the entities responsible for the Flesh-Tearers' corruption possessed patience and sophistication that exceeded anything documented in previous encounters with Chaos forces, suggesting either unprecedented evolution in enemy capabilities or the involvement of actors that operated according to principles beyond current Imperial understanding. The opening of the Great Rift, and the subsequent manifestation of warp phenomena throughout the galaxy, created opportunities to study the Flesh-Tearers' legacy under conditions that had not existed since their destruction. Psychic resonances detected near the former site of their fortress monastery intensified dramatically following the creation of the Psychitrix Maledictum, revealing information about the chapter's final days that had been hidden since the original incident. Brother Librarian Tigurius of the Ultramarines, conducting investigations into these phenomena, as part of broader efforts to understand the Great Rift's effects, discovered that the psychic emanations from Cretaceous contained detailed recordings of events that had occurred during the chapter's civil war. These recordings provided unprecedented insights into how the corruption had operated at the individual level, showing the gradual transformation of loyal Space Marines into willing servants of forces that opposed everything they had once protected. Perhaps most disturbing were the recordings that suggested the corruption had been aware of its eventual discovery, and had been preparing contingency plans to ensure its survival even in the event of the chapter's destruction. The entities responsible for the Flesh Tear's transformation had apparently viewed their fall not as a failure but as a successful test of techniques that could be applied to other targets throughout the Imperium. The resurgence of warp activity following the Great Rift's creation had also revealed the true extent of the Flesh Tear's influence on worlds that had implemented their doctrine during the chapter's active period. Planetary governors who had adopted policies based on the chapter's philosophy found their populations exhibiting signs of corruption that had remained dormant for centuries but were now manifesting in response to increased warp exposure. The careful balance between order and brutality that had once seemed to provide stability was revealing itself to have been a preparation for something far more sinister. Inquisitor Covenant of the Ordo Malleus, investigating these manifestations as part of his broader research into chaos corruption patterns, discovered that the worlds affected by dormant Flesh Tear's influence were experiencing synchronized phenomena that suggested coordination by external intelligence. The timing and nature of the corruption outbreaks indicated that they were not random responses to warp exposure, but rather the activation of prepared positions in a larger strategic plan. The technological legacy of the Flesh Tears had also proven to be more extensive and problematic than initially understood. Equipment and weapon designs that had been cleared for general Imperial use following extensive testing were beginning to exhibit previously undetected flaws that manifested only under specific conditions related to warp exposure. These failures suggested that the corruption affecting the chapter had been more sophisticated in its approach to technology than anyone had realized, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited at predetermined times. Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, reviewing these technological compromises as part of his ongoing efforts to improve Imperial military capabilities, discovered design principles embedded in corrupted equipment that bore striking similarities to techniques he had encountered during his research into ancient technologies from the Dark Age of technology. This discovery raised troubling questions about whether the corruption affecting the Flesh Tearers represented a new development or the resurgence of influences that had been present during humanity's previous Golden Age. The Primaris Marine program, despite its enhanced protections against corruption, had not been entirely immune to influences that seemed related to the Flesh Tear's legacy. Several newly founded chapters had reported incidents involving Battle Brothers exhibiting behaviors that recalled the early stages of the corruption that had consumed their predecessors. While these incidents had been successfully contained, their occurrence suggested that the threat represented by the Flesh Tear's corruption was not limited to the specific genetic flaws of Sanguinius's bloodline. Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels, now serving as regent of the Dark Imperium under Guilliman's authority, had been instrumental in developing new protocols for detecting and preventing the type of gradual corruption that had destroyed the Flesh Tearers. His experience during the devastation of BLL, and subsequent encounters with Chaos forces, had provided him with insights into how such corruption could be recognized and countered before it reached critical mass. The creation of the Unnumbered Sons, those Primaris Marines who served directly under Guilliman's command rather than being assigned to specific chapters, represented in part a response to lessons learned from the Flesh Tearers incident. By maintaining direct oversight of these forces and rotating their assignments regularly, the Primarch hoped to prevent the type of institutional isolation that had allowed corruption to fester undetected within the Flesh Tearers' ranks. Yet even as these protective measures were implemented, new mysteries emerged that suggested the story of the Flesh Tearers was far from over. Reports from the Imperium Nihilus, that half of the galaxy cut off by the Great Rift, described encounters with Space Marines bearing heraldry and equipment that matched historical records of the Flesh Tearers. These sightings were initially dismissed as cases of mistaken identity or the use of salvaged equipment by other forces, but their frequency and consistency began to suggest more troubling possibilities. The most credible of these reports came from Sister Superior Celestine of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, whose own experiences with resurrection and divine intervention lent weight to her observations. During the liberation of the shrine world of Ophelia VII, she reported encountering warriors who fought with the distinctive savagery of the flesh-tearers but displayed capabilities that exceeded even the enhanced parameters documented during the chapter's corruption. These warriors seemed to possess knowledge of Imperial tactics and capabilities that could only have come from sources with access to the highest levels of military intelligence. The theological implications of these sightings were as troubling as their tactical significance. If the flesh-tears had somehow survived their apparent destruction and continued to exist beyond the Great Rift, then the assumptions underlying Imperial responses to chapter corruption required fundamental revision. The possibility that corruption could enable survival under conditions that would destroy loyal forces challenged basic premises about the relationship between virtue and strength that had guided Imperial policy for millennia. Brother Captain Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines, conducting reconnaissance operations in the Imperium Nihilus, provided additional confirmation of flesh-tearers' activity in regions where their presence should have been impossible. His reports described tactical deployments and combat techniques that matched documented flesh-tearers' methods, but were being employed in support of objectives that seemed aligned with Imperial interests rather than chaos corruption. This apparent contradiction forced observers to consider whether the corruption that had consumed the chapter might have evolved in directions that had not been anticipated. The emergence of these mysteries during the Imperium's darkest hour was not coincidental. According to scholars studying the broader patterns of the 41st millennium's conflicts, the same forces that had opened the Great Rift and unleashed unprecedented chaos throughout the galaxy were apparently also activating contingency plans that had been in development for millennia. The flesh-tearers' corruption was beginning to seem less like an isolated incident and more like one component of a larger strategy that encompassed threats and opportunities across multiple timescales. As the Imperium struggles to survive the challenges of the current age, the legacy of the flesh-tearers serves as both warning and guide for how dedicated servants of the Emperor can be transformed into instruments of their own destruction. The courage of those loyalists who chose to die rather than allow corruption to spread, the wisdom of those who learned from their sacrifice, and the ongoing vigilance required to prevent similar tragedies continue to shape Imperial policy and practice in ways that may determine the ultimate fate of humanity itself. The story of the flesh-tearers is not merely historical curiosity, but living reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, the greatest threats often come, not from obvious enemies but from the gradual corruption of those who should be most trusted. Their tale echoes through the corridors of power on Terra and the battlefields of distant worlds, a constant reminder that eternal vigilance is not merely advisable, but absolutely essential for the survival of everything that makes existence worthwhile. In the end, the flesh-tearers achieved a form of immortality that they never sought and would not have desired. They live on not as heroes or villains but as a cautionary tale that embodies the fundamental tragedy of the 41st millennium, where even the noblest intentions and most dedicated service can be turned against the very causes they were meant to protect. Their legacy will endure as long as the Imperium itself, a permanent reminder of both human potential and human vulnerability in a galaxy that offers no easy answers and accepts no simple solutions.